After the family reunion, I checked my account and it was drained. My brother-in-law snorted and said we needed it more than you. Trembling, I reached for my bag and said, "Then you will not mind what is coming next." As they laughed, a loud bang shook the house. The door flew open and everything changed. My name is Joanna. I am 33 years old and a forensic accountant. Today I was supposed to be enjoying a simple holiday cookout. Instead, I was about to dismantle my entire family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Portland, Oregon, meant we had to maintain a flawless image at all times. My parents, William and Linda, built a sprawling estate that looked like it belonged on a luxury magazine cover. It was the 4th of July, and the afternoon sun beat down on their meticulously manicured lawn. The smell of expensive grilled steak and imported sunscreen hung heavy in the air. The backyard was a fortress of wealth, complete with a massive infinity pool and a fully stocked outdoor kitchen. I sat quietly on the periphery of the patio, nursing a glass of iced tea. As usual, I was merely an extra in the grand production of my family perfect life. The main character, as always, was my older sister Melanie. Melanie was 35 and the undisputed golden child of the household. She stood near the shallow end of the pool, wearing a designer sundress that probably cost more than my first car. She was laughing loudly, commanding the attention of every aunt, uncle, and family friend present. Whenever she spoke, my parents hung on her every word, as if she were delivering absolute wisdom. Her husband, Craig, stood nearby holding court with the men. Craig was 38 and the flashy chief executive officer of a local tech logistics startup. He wore a tailored linen shirt and an expensive watch that caught the sunlight every time he gestured. He exuded an arrogance that my parents completely mistook for ambition. They adored him. They constantly praised his business acumen while completely ignoring my successful independent consultancy. To my family, my work was just boring number crunching. They thought I was a simple bookkeeper who filed tax returns for small businesses. They had absolutely no idea what I really did. As a top-tier forensic accountant, I was contracted by private equity firms and the Internal Revenue Service to track offshore embezzlement and uncover corporate fraud. I spent my days hunting down dirty money and dismantling financial criminals. I preferred keeping my true success hidden. Being underestimated by my family was a professional advantage and a personal shield. I watched my mother Linda drift through the crowd carrying a silver tray of catered appetizers. She stopped by Melanie to fix a stray lock of hair, showering her with compliments about her glowing skin. When she finally passed my small table in the corner, she merely told me to sit up straight and asked why I had not worn something more festive and less gloomy. I just nodded and took another sip of my tea. Fighting back was never worth the exhaustion. Or so I thought. The upbeat summer music played softly from the outdoor speakers, blending with the loud chatter of dozens of guests. I pulled my phone from my purse to check the time. Just as the screen lit up, a high-priority encrypted alert from my bank flashed across the display. My stomach tightened immediately. It was a severe fraud notification from my secondary business account. This particular account was a remnant of an old family trust structure. Years ago, my parents had set it up with Melanie listed as an authorized secondary user. It was meant for college expenses back when we were younger. I had completely forgotten to untangle her name from the documentation when I broke away to start my own firm. It was an administrative oversight I was about to regret deeply. I tapped the secure notification and logged into my banking portal. The screen loaded, revealing a completed transaction that made my blood run completely cold. A massive wire transfer had been successfully initiated and cleared less than an hour ago. The amount was exactly $150,000. The recipient account belonged directly to Craig and his tech logistics company. I stared at the numbers on my screen, my mind racing to process the reality of what I was seeing. $150,000 was not a simple banking mistake. It was a deliberate and highly calculated theft. They had drained my account while standing right here in my parents' backyard. A wave of intense heat washed over me, replacing my initial shock with a sharp, focused clarity. For years I had swallowed their passive-aggressive comments. I had quietly accepted the unequal treatment. I had watched my parents happily fund Melanie's lavish lifestyle while I worked late nights to build my business from the ground up entirely on my own. I had tolerated being the scapegoat and the forgotten child. But this was a line they could not uncross. This was not sibling rivalry. This was grand larceny. I stood up abruptly. The metal legs of my patio chair screeched loudly against the stone pavers. The harsh sound cut through the gentle hum of the party like a knife. Conversations around me faltered and died away. A few heads turned in my direction, looking annoyed by the disruption, but I did not care. I gripped my phone tight in my hand and marched directly toward the outdoor bar where Craig was heavily drinking. The summer heat felt oppressive, but I was completely numb to it. I navigated through the crowd of relatives and neighbors, keeping my eyes locked dead on my brother-in-law. He was leaning against the marble counter, swirling an expensive glass of bourbon and laughing at his own joke. He looked so incredibly comfortable and so utterly untouchable. He assumed that because I was the quiet sister, I would be an easy target for his financial crimes. He thought I would eventually notice the missing money and quietly ask my parents for help. He thought I would let them handle it as a private family matter to protect their precious social reputation. He thought wrong. I stepped up to the bar, invading his personal space. I called his name, my voice low but carrying a deadly calm. He stopped laughing and looked at me with a patronizing smile. He asked what was up, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. He asked if I was having fun hiding in the corner. I held my phone up so the screen was inches from his face. The wire transfer confirmation glowed brightly in the afternoon sun. I demanded to know why $150,000 was just wired from my secondary business account directly into his company holding account. The relatives standing nearby suddenly found their drinks very interesting. The upbeat music seemed to fade into the background as silence spread across the bar area. Craig looked at the screen and did not even flinch. There was no flash of guilt in his eyes. There was no stammering attempt to deny what he had done. Instead, he let out a loud, arrogant snort. He waved his free hand dismissively, as if I had just asked him about a minor typo on a grocery list. He chuckled loudly for the crowd and claimed his startup had a minor margin call this week. He said they needed some quick liquidity to keep the investors happy. He explained that Melanie remembered she was still on that old trust account of mine, so they just borrowed the money to tide them over. I repeated the word borrowed, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. I told him he stole $150,000 without my permission. Craig rolled his eyes and took another arrogant sip of his bourbon. He told me not to be so dramatic and claimed it was just a temporary loan. He boldly stated that they needed it more than I did. He said I was single and worked from home all day with no real expenses or responsibilities. He mocked me, asking what I was going to spend that kind of money on anyway, and suggested I would just buy cats. He laughed loudly, and a few of his sycophantic friends chuckled nervously along with him. He looked around at the family, fully expecting me to swallow my pride and back down like I always did when they mocked me. He expected me to lower my head and walk away in tears so they could continue their perfect holiday party. He expected my parents to step in eventually and tell me to be a good team player and support my successful sister. But I was entirely done playing on their team. Instead of crying, I felt a cold, absolute resolve settle over every nerve in my body. I looked at his smug face, and my own face turned to ice. I realized in that exact moment that my family viewed me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited and discarded. I told him quietly that I was not backing down, refusing to break eye contact. I pulled my phone back toward me and unlocked the keypad. Craig smiled widely, waiting for my inevitable retreat. He had absolutely no idea what I was about to do next. I looked right into his arrogant eyes and tapped 3 digits onto my glowing screen. 911. I pressed the green call button and raised the device to my ear. Craig let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head, as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. He actually took another sip of his bourbon, entirely convinced I was bluffing. He thought I was calling a friend to complain, or maybe leaving a voicemail for my therapist. He simply could not fathom that the quiet sister, the one who always absorbed the family punches, would ever strike back. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, asking for my location and the nature of my emergency. My voice was completely steady, devoid of any tears or panic. I stated my full name and provided the exact address of my parents' sprawling suburban estate. I told the dispatcher I needed police presence immediately to report a grand larceny and felony wire fraud in progress. I specified that the perpetrator was currently standing right in front of me and that the stolen amount was $150,000. Craig choked on his expensive bourbon. He coughed violently, the amber liquid spilling down the front of his tailored linen shirt. The smug, confident smile vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden twisting mask of confusion and rising panic. He aggressively wiped his chin and took a step toward me. He asked what I was doing, his voice dropping its jovial tone and taking on a threatening edge. I did not answer him. I ended the call with emergency services and immediately dialed a second number. This was a direct private line to the Elite Fraud Investigation Division at my banking institution. As a forensic accountant who routinely contracted with federal agencies and private equity firms, I did not wait on hold with standard customer service. I bypassed the automated system entirely. A senior fraud investigator answered within seconds. I recited my secure clearance credentials and provided my secondary business account number. I instructed the agent to initiate an immediate hard freeze on the account and flag a fraudulent outbound wire transfer that had cleared within the last hour. I provided Craig exact corporate holding account routing numbers. I told the agent that the funds were stolen by an unauthorized user and that a police report had just been filed. I demanded a complete lockdown on the receiving institution pending a federal inquiry. By the time I lowered my phone from my ear, the atmosphere on the patio had completely shattered. The upbeat summer music still played from the hidden garden speakers, but it was drowned out by the sudden explosive chaos of my family realizing that I was not playing a game. Melanie had been standing near the outdoor kitchen holding a porcelain plate of artisanal sliders. When my words finally registered in her mind, she let out a piercing, theatrical shriek. Her hands flew to her face and the porcelain plate hit the stone pavers. It shattered instantly, sending food and shards of ceramic flying across my mother's pristine patio. Melanie began screaming at the top of her lungs, asking if I was completely insane. She shrieked that I was trying to ruin her husband over a simple family loan and that I was destroying their holiday party out of pure jealousy. My father, William, pushed his way through the stunned crowd of guests. His face was a deep shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck stood out prominently. He was a man used to absolute obedience. As a retired corporate executive, he expected his children to fall into line the moment he raised his voice. He stormed over to me, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. He demanded that I hang up the phone this instant. He yelled that this was a private family business matter and that we did not involve the authorities in our financial arrangements. He ordered me to call the police back and cancel the report before I humiliated the entire family in front of the neighbors. I stood my ground, looking at the man who had gladly written an $80,000 check for Melanie's wedding, but had told me I needed to figure out my own college tuition to build character. I told him the transaction was already flagged and the police were already dispatched. I stated calmly that grand larceny was not a family business matter. It was a felony. Before my father could yell again, my mother Linda rushed into the circle. She moved with a frantic, desperate energy, completely abandoning her carefully cultivated country club persona. She ignored the shattered plates on the ground and shoved past Craig. She lunged at me, grabbing my left arm with both of her hands. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails dug viciously into my bare skin. Her grip was startlingly strong, fueled by the absolute terror of a public scandal. She pulled me close to her so her face was inches from mine. I could smell the Chardonnay on her breath as she hissed at me. Her voice was a venomous, tight whisper meant only for my ears, but filled with decades of conditional love. She told me that if I filed that report, I was dead to this family. She threatened to cut me off completely, telling me I would never be welcome in her home again if I let the police walk through her front doors to question her perfect son-in-law. She squeezed my arm harder, trying to physically force my submission. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I looked down at the hands gripping my arm. These were the hands that had lovingly packed Melanie bags for European vacations while handing me a list of household chores. I reached over with my free hand and placed my fingers over my mother's wrists. With slow, deliberate strength, I pried her fingers off my arm one by one. She gasped slightly in shock as I physically broke her hold on me. I let her hands drop away and looked her dead in the eye. The air between us turned completely frigid. I kept my voice perfectly level, making sure every single syllable carried the weight of my absolute finality. I told her I died to this family a long time ago. My mother stumbled back half a step as if the words had physically struck her. The absolute lack of emotion in my voice terrified her more than if I had screamed. She looked at William, her eyes wide and panicked, silently begging him to fix the situation. But William was staring at me, realizing that his old methods of intimidation were completely useless. The daughter they had conditioned to be the quiet, accommodating scapegoat had vanished. In her place stood a forensic auditor who dismantled financial criminals for a living. A heavy, awkward silence descended over the backyard. The guests stood frozen, gripping their drinks, unsure if they should leave or pretend nothing was happening. Craig stepped forward, trying to salvage his crumbling reality. He forced a nervous laugh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at William and Linda and tried to play the victim. He said I was just being hysterical and blowing a simple corporate bridge loan out of proportion. He promised he would write me a check right now to cover the balance, acting as if he had $150,000 sitting in his personal checking account. I knew for a fact he did not. His company was drowning, and his personal accounts were heavily overdrawn. He was lying to their faces to save his own skin. I did not bother to correct him. I did not need to argue with a man who was already caught in his own trap. I simply adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder and waited. The oppressive silence of the suburban neighborhood was suddenly pierced by a sound that made my mother let out a small, breathless sob. It started as a faint wail in the distance, cutting through the humid July air. Within seconds, the sound grew louder and more insistent. The high-pitched, alternating wail of police sirens echoed down the tree-lined street. The red and blue flashing lights crested the hill, reflecting brightly against the large bay windows of my parents' living room. The sirens cut off abruptly as two police cruisers pulled aggressively into the long, circular driveway, blocking in Craig's expensive imported sports car. I turned my attention back to my brother-in-law. The arrogant, smug smile that he had worn just minutes ago when he mocked me for being single and working from home had completely vanished. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly as the reality of his actions finally breached his massive ego. Heavy, authoritative knocks echoed from the grand mahogany front doors of the estate. The sound vibrated through the house and spilled out onto the patio, signaling the absolute end of my family's carefully constructed facade. Craig looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, desperate realization that his money, his charm, and his golden child wife could not stop what was coming through those doors. Two uniformed officers stepped onto the stone patio, their heavy boots breaking the tense silence that had gripped my parents' backyard. The flashing lights from their cruisers still painted the side of the house in harsh, alternating colors of red and blue, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The party guests parted like the Red Sea, shuffling awkwardly out of the way and trying to blend into the expensive landscaping. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp and buried her face in her hands while my father stood frozen near the expensive stainless steel grill. Craig, however, did exactly what I expected a cornered narcissist to do. He immediately pivoted. The stark panic that had drained the color from his face vanished, replaced in a split second by his polished, charismatic chief executive officer persona. He smoothed the front of his tailored linen shirt, plastered on an easy, confident smile, and walked directly toward the officers with his right hand outstretched. He introduced himself as the head of a major local tech firm, dropping the name of his company and subtly hinting at his various golf club connections within the city government. He offered the officers a cold bottle of water or a fresh plate of catered food, acting the part of the gracious, affluent host whose quiet Sunday afternoon had been rudely interrupted by a minor clerical error. The taller of the two officers politely declined the water, resting his hand on his duty belt. He looked around the silent crowd and asked who had placed the emergency call reporting a felony theft. I stepped forward, raising my hand high. I stated clearly that I was the caller and that exactly $150,000 had just been illegally wired from my private business account to the holding company owned by the man standing right in front of them. Craig let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded incredibly genuine if you did not know he was a calculating sociopath. He shook his head and placed a heavy, condescending hand on my shoulder, which I immediately shoved away with disgust. He turned to the officers and told them that this was nothing more than a trivial family misunderstanding. He gestured expansively to my parents, who were nodding along frantically, and to Melanie, who was wiping away theatrical tears by the edge of the infinity pool. Craig spun a masterful web claiming we were all dealing with a complicated joint family trust and that wires were simply crossed during a routine quarterly portfolio rebalancing. He threw out corporate buzzwords like liquidity margins, asset allocation, and bridge capital, hoping to confuse the street cops into writing the whole thing off as just another wealthy family squabbling over their excessive allowance. The officers turned their attention back to me, their expressions hardening slightly as they tried to decipher who was actually telling the truth. I did not raise my voice or act hysterical. I knew that showing any emotion would only play into Craig's narrative that I was an unstable sister throwing a tantrum. I simply handed the taller officer my phone, displaying the undeniable digital trail. I pointed to the exact timestamp, the routing numbers, and the destination account. I explained that I was the sole proprietor of a forensic accounting firm and that those funds were strictly generated by my independent federal and corporate contracts. I made it absolutely clear that Craig had zero authorization to touch that money under any circumstances and that this was a deliberate act of grand larceny. The officer nodded slowly, taking out a small black notepad. He asked for the specific account details and the origination of the banking structure. He looked me in the eye and asked if anyone else in the family had ever been granted access to the account at any point in time. That was when Craig played his ultimate trump card. He smiled, a predatory grin showing all his teeth, and pulled Melanie forward by her waist. He told the officer that his lovely wife Melanie was actually an authorized signer on the account. He explained that her name was right there on the original legacy trust documents from over a decade ago, and as her husband, he was acting on her behalf to secure family assets. My heart skipped a beat as the brutal realization slammed into my chest. When I first opened that secondary account in my early 20s, it was loosely tied to an old educational trust my parents had set up for us. Melanie had been listed as an emergency secondary user back when we were still naive college students. When I finally broke away from my toxic family to build my own business, I had completely rebuilt my primary financial infrastructure, utilizing secure servers and encrypted banking. But I had carelessly left that specific secondary account open and untouched, using it merely as a holding pen for overflow contract payments. I had completely forgotten that her name was technically still buried deep in the original authorization paperwork sitting in a bank vault somewhere downtown. The officer looked at me and asked if his statement was true. I gritted my teeth, my nails digging into the palms of my hands. I admitted that yes, her name might technically still be on the decade-old origination documents. I quickly added that she had never contributed a single cent to the balance, had never accessed the funds, and had absolutely zero legal right to transfer my hard-earned corporate earnings to save her husband failing startup from bankruptcy. The second officer let out a heavy sigh and clicked his pen closed. The sound was like a physical blow to my stomach. He looked at me with a mixture of professional pity and mild annoyance. He explained that because Melanie was still legally listed as an authorized secondary user on the account, she technically had the right to initiate a transfer. He stated that from a strict law enforcement perspective, no criminal theft had occurred because an authorized user had moved the money. He told me plainly that their hands were completely tied. I felt a cold, absolute fury rising in my chest, threatening to consume me. I stared at the officers and demanded they look at the obvious corporate fraud taking place right in front of them. I pointed out that the money was moved specifically to cover a margin call for a completely separate corporate entity and that this was textbook embezzlement regardless of the legacy signature. The taller officer shook his head, adjusting his utility belt and stepping back. He declared firmly that this was strictly a civil matter. He said the police could not arrest someone for transferring funds from a joint account, even if the other account holder vehemently disagreed with the transaction. He advised me to hire a civil litigation attorney and take it up in a courtroom. I refused to back down entirely. I demanded that they at least file a formal incident report on the record documenting the exact amount transferred, the destination routing numbers, and the statements made by Craig acknowledging the transfer on my parents' patio. I needed the official paper trail for the counterstrike I was already planning in my head. The officers agreed to file the report, handing me a yellow slip of paper with an incident number before turning to leave the property. As the officers walked back down the long driveway and the flashing lights finally disappeared from the front of the house, the atmosphere on the patio shifted instantly. The suffocating tension that had held the holiday party hostage evaporated. It was immediately replaced by a sickening wave of vindication from my family. Craig watched the police cruisers pull away and let out a deep, exaggerated breath. He rolled his shoulders, adjusting his expensive linen shirt, and turned back to face me. The arrogant smirk had fully returned to his face, stretching from ear to ear. He looked like a man who believed he had just conquered the world. He had successfully manipulated the local police, exploited a decade-old administrative loophole, and walked away with $150,000 of my money without a single scratch on his reputation. He walked over to my father and clapped William hard on the shoulder. He laughed loudly, telling my father that the police always appreciate a calm, rational explanation from a fellow businessman. He acted as if he had entirely outsmarted the justice system and beaten me at my own game. My father nodded in eager agreement, patting Craig on the back and offering him a fresh glass of premium bourbon to calm his nerves after my ridiculous stunt. Melanie rushed forward, throwing her arms around Craig's neck as if he were a war hero, returning from a grueling battle rather than a thief who just robbed her sister. The extended family and neighborhood guests began to murmur among themselves, shaking their heads in my direction and whispering about my dramatic and unstable behavior. They were all too eager to accept the convenient narrative that I was the villain for daring to question the golden couple. Emboldened by the police departure and the unwavering blind support of the crowd, my father turned his attention back to me. The relief he felt at avoiding a public arrest quickly mutated into a blinding, self-righteous fury. William marched across the stone pavers, his face dark with a rage I had not seen since I was a teenager. He did not care that dozens of guests were watching our private family nightmare unfold. He wanted to make a public example out of me. He stopped inches from my face, pointing his finger so close to my nose I could feel the air move. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what was severely wrong with me. He yelled that I had just tried to send his innocent son-in-law to prison over a simple banking error. He did not wait for my answer. He launched into a vicious tirade attacking my character, my career, and my entire existence within the family structure. He screamed that I had always been pathologically jealous of Melanie. He shouted that ever since we were children, I could not stand the fact that she was more successful, more beautiful, and more loved by everyone around her. He claimed that my phone call to the police was nothing more than a pathetic, desperate attempt to ruin her perfect marriage because I was so miserable and alone in my own empty life. He told me I was a bitter, spiteful woman who was tearing the family apart from the inside out just to get a little bit of attention. His words echoed across the expansive backyard, bouncing off the surface of the infinity pool and ringing in my ears, setting the stage for a bitter and defining clash. The echo of my father's screaming voice bounced off the pristine brick exterior of their mansion. Jealous. The word hung in the humid air like a toxic cloud. For 33 years, that single word had been their absolute favorite weapon against me. Any time I had an independent thought, any time I demanded basic respect, any time I pointed out a glaring double standard in our household, I was simply dismissed as being jealous of my perfect older sister. I looked at William. His chest was heaving, his face still a dark mottled red from his screaming fit. I did not shrink back into myself the way I had when I was a teenager. I did not drop my gaze to the stone pavers and apologize for causing a scene. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate step forward, invading his personal space, just as aggressively as he had invaded mine. I repeated the word jealous, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that forced everyone on the patio to hold their breath just to hear me. I asked him if he meant the kind of jealous that made me sit quietly in the back row while they paid cash for Melanie's $80,000 destination wedding. I watched his eyes widen slightly, but I did not stop pushing. I asked if he meant the kind of jealous that made me take out massive high-interest student loans for my college tuition while they bought Melanie a brand new luxury sports car as a graduation present. I reminded him of his exact words to me on the day I left for my freshman year of college. I quoted him verbatim, telling him how he looked me in the eye and said girls like me needed to learn the value of a struggle to build character. I asked him what kind of character Melanie was building right now by letting her husband steal my money to fund their collapsing house of cards. Melanie let out a dramatic gasp, clutching her hands to her chest as if she had been physically struck by my words. She cried out to our mother, claiming that I was attacking her on purpose and trying to ruin her holiday weekend. Linda immediately wrapped her arms around Melanie, glaring at me with absolute disgust. Linda yelled that I was being vicious and ungrateful. She said that Melanie had always been more fragile and needed more financial and emotional support, while I was always so fiercely independent and difficult to manage. She framed their blatant financial and emotional neglect as a compliment to my resilience. It was the exact same twisted logic they had used my entire life to justify treating me like a second-class citizen in my own home. William stepped between me and my mother, his massive frame attempting to physically intimidate me into submission. He pointed his thick finger at the wrought iron gate leading out to the driveway. He lowered his voice, projecting the cold corporate authority that had made him a ruthless executive during his career. He told me that this ridiculous temper tantrum was ending right here and right now. He laid out his final terms as if he were negotiating a hostile corporate takeover with a rival business. He demanded that I officially call the bank back and drop the civil suit I had just threatened. He told me I was going to stop harassing Craig and dragging his good name through the mud over a simple accounting error. He insisted that I act like a reasonable adult and wait for Craig to pay me back next quarter when his logistics company finalized its next round of venture capital funding. He said families give each other grace periods and that I was going to give my brother-in-law the grace he deserved. He wanted me to smile and swallow a six-figure theft so his golden child could maintain her illusion of a perfect marriage and limitless wealth. I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his demands wash over me. William was not finished. He crossed his arms over his chest, delivering his ultimate threat to force my compliance. He told me that if I walked out of that gate and pursued this frivolous legal action, I would be completely written out of their will forever. He vowed to call his estate attorney the very next morning and strip my name from every family trust, every piece of property, and every investment portfolio they owned. He promised that I would not see a single dime of the family fortune when they passed away. He looked at me with absolute finality, waiting for the threat of financial ruin to force me to my knees. He expected me to panic at the thought of losing my inheritance. He expected the fear of being truly cut off to break my resolve and force my silence. I looked from William to Linda and then to Melanie, who was peeking out from behind our mother's shoulder with a smug, triumphant little smile. She thought she had won. She thought my parents had just rescued her again and put me firmly back in my place. A sound bubbled up from the back of my throat. It was a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed unnaturally across the silent patio. It was not a laugh of hysteria or panic or defeat. It was a laugh of absolute, genuine amusement at their staggering ignorance. I laughed because they honestly believed their money was the most powerful force in the universe. I laughed because they thought the promise of some future inheritance could control a woman who had already built her own empire entirely in the shadows, away from their judging eyes. I turned away from my father and walked over to the small iron patio table where I had been sitting before this entire nightmare began. I picked up my leather purse and slipped the strap over my shoulder. I picked up my sunglasses and slid them onto my face, masking my eyes completely from their view. Every physical movement I made was slow, deliberate, and perfectly calm. I walked back toward the gate, pausing just a few feet away from where Craig stood. He was still holding his bourbon, his arrogant smirk firmly plastered on his face as he hid behind my parents' wealth. I looked directly at William and Linda, delivering my final promise to the people who had raised me. I told them to keep the inheritance. I kept my voice loud enough for every single party guest and eavesdropping neighbor to hear my parting words. I told my parents they were going to need every single penny of that trust fund to pay for his commissary account. Craig's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. William opened his mouth to scream another insult, but I did not stay to listen to his rage. I turned my back on my biological family, pushed open the heavy wrought iron gate, and walked down the long circular driveway toward my car. I did not look back at the sprawling estate. I did not shed a single tear for the family I was leaving behind. The heavy, oppressive weight that had crushed my chest for my entire life was suddenly gone. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from their toxic fortress. For the first time in 33 years, I felt completely and utterly free. The drive back to my apartment was quiet and smooth. The chaotic noise of the suburban barbecue faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic hum of my tires on the pavement. I lived in a sleek, highly modernized high-rise building downtown. It was a minimalist sanctuary of glass and steel, a stark contrast to the cluttered, heavy opulence of my parents' suburban estate. I parked my car in my secure underground garage and took the private elevator directly up to my top-floor apartment. When I walked through my front door, I dropped my keys on the granite counter and headed straight for my home office. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. I sat down at my massive desk and ran my finger across the biometric scanner on my primary workstation. The heavy-duty dual monitors sprang to life instantly, casting a pale blue light across the dark room. I entered a sequence of complex passwords navigating past 3 layers of encrypted corporate firewalls. My family thought I filed taxes for local bakeries and managed payroll for small businesses. They had no concept of the digital fortress I commanded from this very chair. I bypassed my standard commercial servers and logged directly into a highly secured, restricted federal database. I routed my connection through a secure proxy, accessing the private communication channel I shared with my handler at the federal task force. The screen blinked, displaying a stark black background with a simple encrypted text prompt. A message popped up immediately indicating that the investigator on the other end had been waiting anxiously for my signal. The text glowed in bright green letters across the dark monitor. It was a single urgent question from the federal agent managing the massive corporate fraud case against my brother-in-law. Did he take the bait? I placed my hands on my mechanical keyboard, the soft clicking sound echoing in the silent apartment. I thought about Craig's arrogant smirk and my parents' blind devotion to a criminal. I thought about the $150,000 wire transfer sitting in his frozen holding account, permanently tying him directly to the offshore shell companies we had been tracking for 6 long months. By stealing my money, he had willingly handed us the smoking gun. I typed my response and hit the enter key, sealing his fate forever. Hook, line, and sinker. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown apartment, casting long, sharp shadows across my desk. I had barely slept, having spent the night deep within the secure federal databases, compiling the final digital threads of my brother-in-law criminal network. Despite the lack of sleep, I felt an intense electric clarity. The adrenaline from the patio confrontation had settled into a cold, iron resolve. I reached for my phone to check the time, expecting the usual quiet hum of Sunday morning emails. Instead, my screen was an absolute war zone. It was a solid wall of red notifications, missed calls, and frantic text alerts. While I was quietly securing federal warrants, Melanie and Craig had not wasted a single second. They had spent the night launching a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign across every social media platform they could reach. I unlocked my phone and tapped on a notification. Melanie had posted a 10-minute video to her thousands of followers. I watched her perfectly manicured face contort in mock agony as she sat on her pristine white living room couch. Craig sat beside her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, playing the role of the steadfast, supportive husband to absolute perfection. Melanie looked directly into the camera, squeezing out artificial tears as she spun a masterful, breathtaking web of deceit. She told her audience a heartbreaking story about her deeply troubled, mentally unstable younger sister. She painted a vivid picture of me as a bitter, jealous spinster who had spent her entire adult life resenting her older sister's success and happiness. According to the narrative Melanie wove, my independent accounting consultancy was entirely bankrupt. She claimed my business was failing miserably because of my erratic, paranoid behavior and my inability to maintain professional relationships. She told her followers that I had shown up to our parents' beautiful 4th of July barbecue, demanding a massive financial handout to save my sinking company. When they had gently and lovingly refused to enable my supposed financial ruin, I had completely lost my mind. She claimed I fabricated a wild, delusional story about stolen funds and called the police in a fit of hysterical vengeance. Craig even chimed in toward the end of the video, using his polished, charismatic executive voice to express profound pity for my mental decline. He boldly stated that his booming tech logistics company was currently exploring aggressive legal options to protect its stellar reputation from my malicious extortion attempts. He looked straight into the camera and said they were praying I would finally get the psychiatric help I so desperately needed. It was a spectacular, calculated character assassination designed to completely discredit me before the truth of his embezzlement could ever see the light of day. He was trying to control the narrative, making sure that when the police report surfaced, everyone would view it as the ramblings of a lunatic rather than the evidence of a massive corporate fraud. The video had been shared hundreds of times within hours. The comments section was a cesspool of strangers offering their prayers for Melanie and condemning my toxic behavior. But the public comments were nothing compared to the direct assault on my personal phone. My extended family had been fully mobilized. They were the flying monkeys deployed by Melanie manufactured tears to do her dirty work and protect the family image. Text messages poured in from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not bothered to speak to me in years. Aunt Martha sent a blistering paragraph accusing me of trying to destroy my sister's perfect marriage out of pure, unadulterated spite. She told me I was a disgrace to the family name and that my behavior was exactly why I was still single and alone at my age. My cousin David, a man who had borrowed money from my parents twice to fund his failed restaurant, called me a miserable parasite. He warned me that the entire extended family was cutting me off completely until I issued a public apology to Craig and begged for my parents' forgiveness. Even relatives I barely knew chimed in, demanding I drop my ridiculous accusations and stop humiliating William and Linda in front of their country club friends. They swallowed Melanie's narrative without a single question or a moment of hesitation. They were so eager to believe that I was the broken, toxic burden they had always suspected me to be. They hurled insults about my childless home and my supposedly failed career, using every vulnerability I had ever shared in confidence as a weapon against me. They demanded I retract my police report immediately, threatening to show up at my apartment if I did not answer their calls. Any normal person would have cracked under the immense, suffocating pressure of an entire family turning against them. A younger version of myself might have frantically typed out paragraphs of desperate rebuttals. The old Joanna would have begged them to look at the bank statements, pleading for just one person to believe me over the golden child. The old Joanna would have posted a tearful counter video defending my sanity and my bank account, trying to clear my name in the court of public opinion. But that Joanna was gone. She had died on that patio the moment my mother threatened to disown me for reporting a felony. I did not engage. I did not type a single angry reply. I did not defend myself to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. Instead, I sat at my desk, took a slow sip of my black coffee, and methodically began blocking every single number that flashed across my screen. I blocked Aunt Martha. I blocked Cousin David. I blocked the neighbors who felt entitled to text their unwanted opinions. I went into my social media settings and locked down every profile, muting all notifications, and effectively rendering myself a digital ghost to anyone connected to my parents. I let the digital storm rage outside my fortress while I sat in absolute chilling silence. Every hateful message they sent was just more proof of how little I meant to them, making my ultimate goal that much easier to execute. Their blind loyalty to Craig Facade only proved that I owed them absolutely nothing. I turned my attention back to my secure servers, pushing the family drama out of my mind. I had real work to do. I opened the encrypted files containing the honeypot data Craig had so willingly stepped into. The $150,000 he had wired from my secondary account was currently frozen, but the digital footprint it left behind was a goldmine. Because he had transferred funds from a federally monitored tracking account directly into his corporate holding account, he had inadvertently connected his legitimate business front to the offshore shell companies I had been investigating. I spent the next 3 hours compiling the final layers of financial forensics, organizing the wire transfers, the fake vendor invoices, and the fabricated margin calls into a pristine, undeniable portfolio of evidence. The noise of their social media smear campaign meant absolutely nothing compared to the quiet, devastating power of hard federal data. Let them call me crazy on the internet. I was preparing to hand the federal government the exact coordinates of Craig's hidden offshore empire. The sharp, piercing buzz of my apartment intercom broke my intense focus just as the clock struck noon. I pressed the button on my desk console. The front desk concierge announced that a legal courier was waiting downstairs with a high-priority certified delivery requiring my direct physical signature. I instructed the concierge to send the courier up to my floor. A few moments later, I opened my heavy oak front door to find a man in a crisp uniform holding an oversized, heavy manila envelope. I signed the digital pad, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. I took the thick package and locked my door. I walked back to my kitchen counter, grabbed a letter opener, and sliced the heavy cardstock envelope open. Inside was a massive stack of legal documents, bearing the embossed gold letterhead of Portland's most ruthless and expensive corporate law firm. It was a brutal, aggressively worded cease and desist order. Craig attorneys were officially threatening to bury me under a mountain of defamation, libel, and tortious interference lawsuits if I did not immediately retract my police report and issue a formal signed public apology to his tech company. The legal document accused me of attempting to extort a successful enterprise and warned that they would seek emergency injunctions to seize my business assets and ruin my professional reputation permanently if I spoke another word about the wire transfer. I read through the threatening legalese, feeling a cold smile slowly spread across my face. Craig was trying to use his high-priced lawyers to bully me into silence. He thought a stack of expensive paper would terrify the quiet accountant into dropping the case. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. He had no idea that sending this threat using his corporate legal counsel just provided me with the final piece of evidence I needed to prove he was using company resources to cover up a personal felony. I folded the cease and desist letter carefully and placed it right on top of my evidence file. The soft green glow of the encrypted confirmation message illuminated the dark office, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I stared at the words for a long moment, letting the absolute finality of the trap sink into my bones. Hook, line, and sinker. I closed the secure terminal powered down the workstation and walked away from the desk. I slept that night with a profound, dreamless peace that I had not experienced since I was a small child. When the morning sun finally pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my high-rise apartment, I woke up feeling dangerously clear-headed. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and casually tapped the screen of my phone to check the time. I was instantly met with a solid wall of red notifications. My screen was an absolute war zone of missed calls, frantic text alerts, and urgent social media tags. While I had been quietly sleeping, the sleep of the victorious Melanie, and Craig had spent the entire night launching a vicious, highly coordinated digital smear campaign. I opened the primary social media application and was immediately greeted by a 10-minute video posted to Melanie public profile. It had already amassed thousands of views and hundreds of shares. I tapped the screen and watched my sister's perfectly manicured face contort in mock agony. She sat on her pristine white living room couch, wearing a soft, oversized cashmere sweater designed to make her look small, vulnerable, and deeply exhausted. Craig sat closely beside her, his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, playing the role of the steadfast, supportive husband to absolute perfection. Melanie looked directly into the camera lens, squeezing out artificial tears as she spun a masterful, breathtaking web of deceit. She spoke in a trembling whisper, telling her captivated audience a heartbreaking story about her deeply troubled, mentally unstable younger sister. She painted a vivid, relentless picture of me as a bitter, jealous spinster who had spent her entire adult life resenting her older sister's success and happiness. According to the narrative Melanie wove for her followers, my independent accounting consultancy was entirely bankrupt. She claimed my business was failing miserably because of my erratic, paranoid behavior and my inability to maintain basic professional relationships. She told the camera that I had shown up to our parents' beautiful holiday party completely broke and demanding a massive financial handout to save my sinking company. When they had gently and lovingly refused to enable my financial ruin, I had completely lost my mind. She claimed I fabricated a wild, delusional story about stolen funds and called the police in a fit of hysterical vengeance. Craig even chimed in toward the end of the video, using his polished, charismatic executive voice to express profound pity for my mental decline. He boldly stated that his booming tech logistics company was currently exploring aggressive legal options to protect its stellar reputation from my malicious extortion attempts. He looked straight into the camera and said they were praying I would finally get the psychiatric help I so desperately needed. It was a spectacular, calculated character assassination designed to completely discredit me before the truth of his embezzlement could ever see the light of day. He was frantically trying to control the narrative, making sure that when the police report eventually surfaced, everyone would view it as the sad ramblings of a lunatic rather than the concrete evidence of a massive corporate fraud. The comment section beneath the video was a toxic cesspool of strangers offering their heartfelt prayers for Melanie and viciously condemning my supposed behavior. They praised Craig for his patience and vilified me for trying to tear apart a beautiful family. But the public comments were nothing compared to the direct assault on my personal phone. My extended family had been fully mobilized overnight. They were the flying monkeys deployed by Melanie, manufactured tears to do her dirty work and protect the fragile family image at all costs. Text messages poured in from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not bothered to speak to me in years. Aunt Martha sent a blistering, massive block of text, accusing me of trying to destroy my sister's perfect marriage out of pure, unadulterated spite. She told me I was a disgrace to the family name, and that my unhinged behavior was exactly why I was still single and alone at my age. My cousin David, a man who had borrowed money from my parents twice to fund his failed restaurant ventures, called me a miserable parasite. He warned me that the entire extended family was cutting me off completely until I issued a public apology to Craig and begged for my parents' forgiveness on my hands and knees. Even relatives I barely knew chimed in demanding I drop my ridiculous accusations and stop humiliating William and Linda in front of their wealthy friends. They swallowed Melanie's narrative without a single question or a moment of hesitation. They were so eager to believe that I was the broken, toxic burden they had always suspected me to be. They hurled insults about my childless home and my supposedly failed career, using every vulnerability I had ever shared in confidence as a weapon to break my spirit. They demanded I retract my police report immediately, threatening to show up at my apartment and force me to apologize if I did not answer their endless calls. They operated exactly how a narcissistic family system operates, circling the wagons to protect the golden child, while brutally sacrificing the scapegoat on the altar of public opinion. Any normal person would have cracked under the immense suffocating pressure of an entire family turning against them in a coordinated mob. A younger version of myself might have frantically typed out paragraphs of desperate rebuttals defending my sanity and my bank accounts. The old Joanna would have begged them to look at the bank statements, pleading for just one person in the family to believe me over the golden child. The old Joanna would have posted a tearful counter video, trying to clear my name in the vicious court of public opinion. But I did not engage. I did not type a single angry reply. I did not defend myself to people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me. I sat at my kitchen counter taking slow measured sips of my coffee and clinically read through the hateful messages. I analyzed their vitriol with the same cold emotional detachment I used when auditing a corrupted corporate ledger. I felt absolutely no urge to reply. Their blind loyalty to Craig Facade only proved that I owed them nothing. I set my coffee mug down and methodically began blocking every single number that flashed across my screen. I blocked Aunt Martha. I blocked Cousin David. I blocked the neighborhood friends who felt entitled to text their unwanted opinions. I went into my social media settings and locked down every profile, muting all notifications, and effectively rendering myself a digital ghost to anyone connected to my parents. I let the digital storm rage outside my fortress while I sat in absolute chilling silence. I finished my coffee, showered, and dressed in a sharp-tailored suit. I left my apartment and drove to my actual physical office, located in the heart of the financial district. My family thought I balanced ledgers for local florists and suburban dental practices out of a cramped home office. They had no idea that I occupied a corner suite in a premium high-rise surrounded by a dedicated team of junior analysts and legal clerks. I walked past my receptionist offering a polite morning greeting and stepped into my private office, closing the heavy glass door behind me. I sat down at my expansive desk and continued preparing my strategic counterstrike. I ignored the dying echoes of my family's smear campaign and focused entirely on the hard, irrefutable data. I compiled the digital trails, the routing numbers, the time-stamped wire transfers, and the formal police report into a pristine, organized physical file. I was building a guillotine out of paperwork, and every false statement Melanie made online only sharpened the blade. I was deep into reviewing a secondary set of offshore banking records when the soft buzz of my desk intercom broke the intense silence of my office. My receptionist voice came through the speaker, sounding slightly confused. She announced that a specialized legal courier had just arrived at the front desk and was demanding to deliver a package to me directly. She noted that the courier refused to leave the package with the front desk and insisted on acquiring my personal physical signature. I pressed the intercom button and calmly instructed her to send the courier back to my office. A few moments later, a man in a crisp, dark uniform stepped through my glass door, carrying a heavy, oversized manila envelope. His expression was stern and strictly professional. He handed me an electronic tablet and a stylus, pointing to the glowing signature line. I signed my name with a smooth, practiced motion and accepted the package. The courier turned on his heel and walked out, leaving me alone with the heavy envelope resting on the center of my mahogany desk. I did not need to open it to know what it was, but I reached into my top drawer and pulled out a silver letter opener anyway. I sliced through the thick cardstock and pulled out a massive stack of premium legal paper. The documents bore the embossed gold letterhead of Portland's most ruthless, expensive, and aggressive corporate law firm. It was exactly what I had been waiting for. I unfolded the thick stack of paper and began to read. It was a brutal, aggressively worded cease and desist letter, drafted by a team of high-priced litigators representing Craig Tech Logistics Company. The legal document formally accused me of attempting to extort a highly successful enterprise through malicious falsehoods. It stated that my actions at the holiday party constituted a targeted campaign of harassment driven by personal financial desperation. The letter warned that if I did not immediately retract my police report, drop all civil claims, and issue a formal signed public apology to Craig and his board of directors, they would unleash the full weight of their legal department upon me. They threatened to bury me under a mountain of defamation, libel, and tortious interference lawsuits. They promised to seek emergency legal injunctions to seize my business assets, freeze my personal accounts, and ruin my professional reputation permanently if I spoke another word about the wire transfer. The language was designed to intimidate, to crush the spirit of a civilian with the overwhelming, terrifying threat of endless corporate litigation. It was the ultimate bullying tactic from a man who believed his stolen money made him untouchable. I read through the final page detailing the millions of dollars in damages they intended to seek, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. The coffee shop I chose for our meeting was a bustling, independent roaster situated right in the center of the downtown financial district. It was an environment composed entirely of exposed brick-polished concrete floors and the constant grinding hiss of commercial espresso machines. I arrived 20 minutes early and selected a small, circular table tucked into the far back corner, offering a clear, unobstructed view of the heavy glass entrance doors. I sat perfectly still, with a plain black coffee resting untouched in front of me, my leather briefcase sitting heavily on the chair directly to my right. This was my territory. It was miles away from the manicured lawns, the country club gossip, and the suffocating suburban fortress of my parents' estate. Here, among the sharp suits and the rapid-fire pace of corporate workers, their usual tactics of intimidation held absolutely no power. My parents walked through the front doors exactly 7 minutes late. It was a classic calculated power play that my father William had utilized in corporate boardrooms for 4 decades. He believed that making people wait established dominance before a single word was ever spoken. He wore a pair of impeccably tailored golf slacks and a crisp navy blue polo shirt, projecting the relaxed, unbothered image of a man whose weekend had not been completely derailed by a major family crisis. My mother, Linda, walked half a step behind him, clutching her expensive designer handbag tightly against her stomach like a physical shield. Her face was expertly set in a rigid mask of stern maternal disappointment, a look she had been practicing and perfecting since I was a teenager. They scanned the crowded room, spotted me in the dark corner, and immediately made their way over, navigating the narrow aisles with an air of absolute entitlement. They did not look like concerned parents arriving to mend a traumatic rupture with their youngest daughter. They looked exactly like victorious generals arriving to accept an unconditional surrender from a defeated enemy. William slid into the wooden chair opposite me while Linda took the seat to his left. Neither of them offered a greeting or a simple hello. William merely laced his thick fingers together, rested his forearms on the surface of the small table, and looked at me with an expression of profound, heavy pity. He started the conversation by telling me he was genuinely glad I had finally come to my senses and requested this meeting. He casually mentioned the cease and desist letter that had been delivered to my office, assuming that the heavy-handed legal threat from Craig high-priced corporate attorneys had done its intended job and terrified me into submission. He spoke in the deep, resonant tone of a chief executive officer addressing a severely misguided junior employee. He told me that his own lawyers had strongly advised him not to speak with me at all, given my erratic behavior, but he was making a generous exception today because family must always come first. Linda chimed in immediately, seamlessly layering her syrupy condescension over his corporate bluster. She leaned across the small table, attempting to place her hand over mine, but I smoothly and deliberately pulled my hand away, resting it in my lap. She let out a long, dramatic sigh, telling me that Melanie was still deeply traumatized and physically ill over my online behavior and my vicious attempts to ruin her reputation. She mentioned the coordinated social media campaign, spinning it as a necessary act of tough love from an extended family, that was only trying to guide me back to the light. Linda told me that despite my horrific actions, Melanie possessed a beautiful, forgiving heart and was willing to move past this unfortunate episode if I simply did the right thing and issued a heartfelt, public apology. William then took over to lay out their specific terms for my redemption. I was to immediately contact the local precinct and formally withdraw my police report, claiming it was filed during a mental health crisis. I was to contact Craig legal team to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, binding me to permanent silence regarding the $150,000 wire transfer. I was to completely drop my frivolous civil claims and publicly retract any negative statements I had made about his incredibly successful logistics company. In exchange for my complete capitulation, they would generously halt the process of writing me out of the family will, and perhaps allow me to attend Thanksgiving dinner on a probationary basis. I sat there in total silence, letting their staggering arrogance fill the small space between us. I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my voice or defend my sanity against their ridiculous accusations. I just listened to my father lecture me on the true meaning of loyalty, while my mother lectured me on the concept of grace. I watched them confidently build their magnificent glittering house of cards higher and higher, completely unaware that the foundation had already been entirely washed away. When William finally finished his practiced monologue, he leaned back against the wooden chair, crossing his arms over his chest, and waited for my response. He fully expected tears. He expected a frantic, desperate plea for their forgiveness. He expected me to beg for my place back in the family hierarchy, acknowledging that I was the broken, defective daughter they always claimed I was. I reached over to the empty chair beside me and unclasped the heavy brass buckle of my leather briefcase. I did not pull out the intimidating cease and desist letter they thought had broken me. I did not pull out a drafted apology to my sister. I pulled out a single thick piece of premium paper. It was a certified public record printed with razor-sharp black ink and bearing the raised official seal of the county clerk office. I placed the document face down on the wooden table, keeping my palm pressed flat against the back of the page. I looked directly at my father, meeting his condescending glare with absolute ice-cold neutrality. I told him that I did not ask for this meeting to beg for my money back. I told him that my federal task force had already seized those funds and secured them in an evidence locker. I told him that I did not call this meeting to apologize to Melanie or to beg for my reinstatement into their precious will. I slowly slid the heavy paper across the smooth surface of the table until it stopped exactly halfway between us. I looked at William and told him to pick it up. William frowned, his thick gray eyebrows drawing together in a deep V of sudden irritation. He clearly thought this was another trick, another one of my supposedly dramatic, hysterical stunts. He let out a sharp, dismissive breath, picked up the certified document, and flipped it over. I watched his eyes drop to the top of the page. I had taken the liberty of highlighting the most critical sections in bright fluorescent yellow ink, ensuring he would not miss a single devastating detail in the dense legal jargon. I kept my voice perfectly level, matching the ambient noise of the coffee shop as I delivered the final lethal blow to their perfect suburban illusion. I told him that before he permanently disowned his youngest daughter, to protect his brilliant golden son-in-law, he might want to ask Craig why he secretly leveraged their fully paid-off retirement home to pay off his furious offshore investors. The silence that instantly fell over our small table was absolute and heavy. The ambient background noise of the busy coffee shop, the grinding espresso beans, the clinking ceramic mugs, the lively chatter of other patrons seemed to completely vanish, leaving a ringing vacuum in my ears. William stared down at the paper. His eyes darted back and forth across the highlighted text, reading the exact same lines over and over again, as if his brain simply refused to translate the English words into a reality he could comprehend. Linda looked rapidly from my calm face to William's frozen posture, her mask of smug disappointment slipping instantly into a state of genuine rising panic. She placed a trembling hand on his arm, asking him what the paper was and demanding to know what I was talking about. William could not answer her. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged from his throat. The document he was holding was a massive commercial second mortgage taken out against the entire equity of my parents' sprawling suburban estate. The principal amount was staggering, reaching well into the multi-millions, securing a massive line of credit against the property they had worked their entire lives to own outright. And the authorizing signature sitting at the very bottom of the page alongside a fraudulently acquired and illegally notarized power of attorney was Craig. I did not give them a moment to catch their breath. I maintained my clinical forensic tone, laying out the absolute destruction of their golden child life. I explained that Craig, a highly successful tech logistics company, had never been successful at all. It was a crumbling, sophisticated shell company Ponzi scheme that had been bleeding unrecoverable cash for over 2 years. I told them that he had been illegally using new investor money to pay off massive old debts while simultaneously funding his lavish, extravagant lifestyle with Melanie. When the venture capital completely dried up and the federal regulators began circling his offshore accounts, he became frantic. I explained that the $150,000 he stole from my account was just a desperate temporary fix to cover a single, immediate margin call. But the real money, the massive millions he needed to keep his violent, angry offshore investors from completely destroying him, he had extracted directly from the equity of their pristine estate. He had forged their names, falsified their consent, and gambled their entire life savings to buy himself a few more months of freedom. By transferring those specific funds from my highly monitored federal honeypot account, he had inadvertently handed my task force the final missing link connecting his domestic fraud directly to his illegal international wire network. I watched the devastating realization physically strike my parents. The absolute, undeniable truth crashing through decades of blind denial and toxic favoritism, destroying everything they believed to be true. William's face rapidly drained of all color, leaving his usually ruddy skin a sickly, translucent shade of ashen gray. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy legal paper rattled audibly against the wooden table. He dropped the certified document as if the paper itself had suddenly caught fire. He did not look at me. He did not look at Linda, who was now staring down at the highlighted mortgage amounts with wide, terrified, unblinking eyes. William frantically dug his shaking hand into the front pocket of his golf slacks and pulled out his cell phone. His thick thumb fumbled clumsily against the smooth glass screen as he desperately brought up his contacts and selected Craig Private Direct Personal Number. He pressed the phone hard against his ear, his chest heaving, his breath coming in short, rapid, shallow gasps. I sat perfectly still, watching the proud, arrogant man who had terrified and belittled me for 33 years completely unravel in the middle of a public coffee shop. We sat in agonizing silence, waiting for the brilliant golden child husband to pick up the line and smoothly explain away this massive, catastrophic mistake. We waited for Craig to use his charm to fix the unfixable, but the ringing stopped almost immediately. William pulled the phone slowly away from his ear, his eyes widening with absolute sheer bottomless terror as a cold, recorded automated voice echoed loudly from the small speaker, announcing that the number you have dialed is no longer in service. William slammed his phone down on the coffee shop table with such force that the ceramic mugs rattled against the wood. The cold, automated voice indicating a disconnected number still echoed in his mind, mocking his unwavering faith in his son-in-law. He looked at the printed public record lying between us, and then at Linda, whose face was frozen in a mask of absolute sheer horror. Without uttering another word to me, William grabbed his wife by the arm, leaving his lukewarm coffee and the devastating legal document behind. They did not demand an explanation from me. They did not ask how I had bypassed privacy firewalls to find the commercial mortgage records. They simply fled the coffee shop, desperate to find the one man who could tell them this was all a terrible, hysterical misunderstanding. I sat quietly in the back corner of the roaster and watched through the large glass windows as they practically ran to their luxury sedan. They were speeding toward Craig downtown corporate headquarters, racing to construct a barrier of denial before the reality of their total financial ruin could fully set in. The drive to the tech logistics firm took less than 20 minutes, but for William and Linda, It must have felt like an eternity suspended over a terrifying pitch-black abyss. They burst through the double-glass doors of the executive suite, bypassing the polished reception desk entirely. They ignored the frantic protests of the young administrative assistant and pushed their way directly into Craig's expansive corner office. Craig was standing by his massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, holding a sleek silver tablet and dictating an email to an associate. He spun around, a flash of genuine dark irritation crossing his handsome features at the sudden, unannounced intrusion. But the moment he registered his in-laws' pale, terrified faces, the irritation vanished completely. He seamlessly slipped into his practiced role as the steady, reliable, and endlessly successful patriarch of the family. William did not bother with the usual country club pleasantries. His voice shook with a potent mixture of raw terror and lingering anger as he demanded to know exactly what was happening with their retirement estate. He explained the certified document I had presented at the coffee shop, his words tumbling out in a breathless, frantic rush. He told Craig about the multi-million-dollar second mortgage, the supposedly forged signatures, and the horrifying implication that their entire paid-off property had been secretly leveraged without their consent. Linda stood right beside him, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a physical shield. She stared at Craig, waiting for him to laugh, to dismiss the absurd accusation, to assure them both that her vindictive, jealous spinster daughter was simply playing another cruel, elaborate trick to ruin their happiness. For a fraction of a second, the charismatic facade cracked. A heavy muscle jumped in Craig's tight jaw, and his eyes darted nervously toward his closed laptop sitting on the expansive mahogany desk. But Craig was a master manipulator, a man who had built an entire lucrative career on selling elaborate illusions to wealthy, greedy investors. He took a slow, deep breath, let out a warm, reassuring chuckle, and walked over to guide Linda to a plush leather sofa. He looked William dead in the eye and shook his head with an expression of profound, weary disappointment. He told them he simply could not believe Joanna had gone this far to tear the family apart. He smoothly admitted that yes, there was a secondary financial instrument attached to their property, but he immediately framed it as an exclusive, highly confidential wealth-building strategy that he had been managing entirely on their behalf. He used dizzying, sophisticated corporate jargon, throwing around complex terms like bridge loans, temporary liquidity leveraging, and aggressively managed yield portfolios. Craig placed a heavy, comforting hand on William's shoulder and explained that the international tech logistics market was experiencing an unprecedented temporary cash flow bottleneck due to global supply chain restructuring. He claimed he had used the dormant equity in their estate as a short-term, completely secure commercial bridge loan to secure a massive, highly lucrative overseas contract. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, treating William like an equal partner in a billionaire genius game. He promised them that this specific financial maneuver was designed to guarantee them a staggering 20% return on their investment within the very next fiscal quarter. He spun a masterful, hypnotic tale of extreme wealth, assuring them that he was only trying to quietly double their retirement fund so they could live out their golden years in absolute luxury without ever having to worry about taxes or market volatility again. As for the forged signatures, Craig did not miss a single beat. He reminded William of a thick stack of routine corporate tax documents he had asked him to sign in a hurry during a family barbecue several months ago. He claimed the bridging authorization had been included in that stack, a simple administrative oversight that he had meant to discuss with them but had forgotten in the fast-paced chaos of securing their massive financial return. He then masterfully shifted the focus right back to me. He shook his head sadly, telling them that Joanna must have illegally hacked into his corporate servers, wildly misinterpreted complex financial structures, and weaponized the stolen data out of pure, unadulterated jealousy over Melanie's perfect life. He told William that small-time bookkeepers simply do not understand high-level capital leveraging, and that my panic was the result of profound financial ignorance combined with a desperate need for attention. William and Linda soaked up the magnificent lie like parched earth absorbing rain. It was infinitely easier for them to swallow Craig's fabricated story of a brilliant high-yield investment strategy than to face the catastrophic reality that their golden son-in-law had stolen their home out from under them. They desperately needed to believe that they were the savvy beneficiaries of a financial masterstroke, not the gullible, ruined victims of a ruthless con artist. The tension visibly drained from Linda's rigid shoulders. She let out a shaky breath of relief, reaching out to squeeze Craig's hand, and tearfully apologizing for ever doubting his intentions for even a second. William's chest puffed out again, his arrogant, aggressive posture returning in full force. He eagerly embraced the delusion. He loudly condemned my actions, declaring that my vicious attempt to frame Craig was the final absolute straw. Standing in that polished office surrounded by the glossy illusion of Craig's corporate success, William and Linda officially doubled down on their allegiance. They promised Craig that they would completely and permanently cut me out of their lives. They vowed to remove my name from the family trust entirely before the week was over, and assured him they would fully support whatever aggressive legal actions his company needed to take against me to protect his stellar reputation. They left the executive office a few minutes later, their fragile reality temporarily restored, completely blind to the fact that they had just thanked the very man who had destroyed them. The moment the heavy glass door clicked shut behind his in-laws, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet to freezing. Craig stood perfectly still, listening to their retreating footsteps echo down the corridor. As the sound faded, his polished, confident smile dissolved into a grimace of pure, suffocating panic. The color completely drained from his face, and a cold, clammy sweat broke out across his forehead. He rushed over to the heavy oak doors and quickly flipped the deadbolt, locking himself safely inside. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely open the lid of his secure workstation. He dropped heavily into his leather executive chair and frantically typed in his encrypted passwords to access his primary offshore banking portals. He needed to move the remaining leveraged funds immediately. He needed to hide the stolen cash before my federal task force could trace the routing numbers back to his hidden shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He hit the enter key and waited for the familiar green dashboards of his hidden wealth to load across the screen. Instead, the monitor flashed bright, blinding red. A stark, hostile system error message filled the display, indicating that absolute access to the requested international routing numbers had been denied. Craig's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slammed his fist against the mahogany desk, minimizing the window, and opening a secondary private portal linking directly to his secure broker in Geneva. Again the screen glowed an unforgiving bloody red. Every single account, every hidden ledger, every stash of stolen money was completely locked out. Raw desperation clawed at his throat. He grabbed his encrypted satellite phone, completely abandoning his disconnected personal line, and hastily dialed his overseas financial broker. He pressed the receiver hard against his ear, his breathing ragged and shallow as he listened to the international connection ring. He paced behind his desk, preparing to demand an immediate manual override, ready to scream at whatever junior associate dared to freeze his massive assets. But no human voice answered the frantic call. Instead, a chilling automated message echoed through the speaker in a crisp, heavily accented tone. The voice calmly informed him that the requested financial portfolios were currently inaccessible due to an ongoing international compliance hold, and all related assets had been permanently frozen under the direct absolute authority of federal financial regulators. The heavy cardstock of the cease and desist letter felt completely weightless against the massive mountain of federal documentation I had already compiled. Craig truly believed he had me backed into a corner. He thought his aggressive, high-priced legal posturing would force me to retreat into the shadows, just like my parents had always forced me to do. But his intimidation tactics were not finished. A soft chime from my secure encrypted email terminal drew my attention away from the physical documents on my desk. I opened the message and found a highly sensitive communication from the chief financial officer of a mid-sized manufacturing firm, one of my longest-standing public clients. The executive email was carefully worded and thick with corporate politeness, but the underlying message was unmistakably clear. He was reaching out to inquire about sudden alarming rumors regarding my professional integrity. He mentioned hearing quiet, persistent whispers circulating through the downtown business network, suggesting that my consultancy was currently under active investigation for profound financial instability and erratic, unethical behavior. I sat back in my leather executive chair and watched as two more similar emails populated my inbox within the hour. Craig was rapidly escalating his attack, moving far beyond the emotional manipulation of our family and directly targeting my professional livelihood. He was utilizing his extensive country club connections and his polished corporate network to subtly poison the well. He was making strategic phone calls to local executives he golfed with, planting seeds of doubt and masking his malicious sabotage as genuine concern for the local business community. I could easily picture him standing in his corner office, wearing a custom-tailored suit, shaking his head in mock sorrow as he warned my clients about my supposed mental breakdown. He was systematically attempting to isolate me, ensuring that when the dust settled, I would be left completely bankrupt, professionally ruined, and entirely dependent on the very family that was currently trying to destroy me. It was a classic scorched earth strategy designed to obliterate any credibility I possessed before my accusations against him could gain traction. Any ordinary accountant would have been paralyzed by the sheer terror of watching their entire client base evaporate in a single afternoon. A struggling, independent bookkeeper would have been frantically drafting defense statements, returning phone calls in a panic, and begging clients not to terminate their contracts. But sitting in my quiet, secure corner office, I remained entirely unfazed. In fact, I felt a deep, profound sense of amusement bubbling up in my chest. Craig was exhausting his resources and burning his precious social capital to destroy a ghost. He fundamentally misunderstood the entire nature of my existence. He believed the carefully constructed narrative my mother had peddled for years, the pathetic story of the quiet, unremarkable daughter running a mediocre, struggling accounting firm. He thought my small roster of local businesses was the absolute limit of my professional capacity. The reality was something Craig could not possibly comprehend, because his staggering arrogance blinded him to anyone operating outside his own inflated ego. My small public consultancy was nothing more than a convenient, low-profile front. I was not a struggling neighborhood bookkeeper desperately trying to balance ledgers for local florists and dental offices. I was a top-tier forensic auditor, a highly specialized financial predator contracted directly by multinational private equity firms, and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. My actual job, the covert work that funded my high-rise apartment and my secure server arrays, involved tearing apart the complex digital architecture of international money laundering rings. I spent my days hunting down missing billions, tracing phantom assets through the Cayman Islands, slicing through Swiss bank secrecy layers, and unmasking high-net-worth corporate criminals. Craig thought he was outsmarting a suburban amateur, while he was actually attempting to play a rigged game against the house. I turned my attention back to the primary monitor, pulling up the deeply buried architecture of his so-called successful enterprise. Craig Tech Logistics Company was a spectacular, shimmering facade. To the outside world, to his wealthy friends, and to my easily impressed parents, he was a visionary executive pioneering the future of global supply chain management. But the financial autopsies I had been quietly running for the federal task force revealed a completely different, terrifying reality. His company was a hollow, crumbling shell, entirely devoid of actual profitable operations. He was running an aggressive, highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He was constantly funneling new investor capital to pay off furious early backers, all while skimming massive percentages off the top to fund the lavish, extravagant lifestyle that kept Melanie perfectly draped in cashmere and diamonds. He was generating fabricated vendor invoices and producing forged margin calls to hide the massive gaping holes in his balance sheets. The entire structure was built on quicksand, and the ground had started shifting violently months ago. He had been desperate, absolutely starving for untraceable liquidity to cover a massive incoming margin call that threatened to expose his entire shadow operation. That blinding desperation led him to make the most catastrophic mistake of his entire miserable life. When he accessed my secondary bank account to steal the $150,000, he believed he was taking money from a weak, defenseless sister-in-law who would be too intimidated by the family dynamics to ever fight back. He thought it was clean, untethered cash that he could quickly wash through his corporate accounts. He had no idea that the account he breached was a highly monitored digital honeypot. The money he transferred was not my personal savings. It was a pool of specialized, trackable federal bait funds intentionally seeded into that account weeks prior as part of my ongoing covert investigation into his business practices. I had deliberately left the digital backdoor open, creating a vulnerability that his arrogant entitlement simply could not resist. The federal funds were tagged with specific alphanumeric identifiers that trigger automated reporting the absolute second they are routed through international clearinghouses. When Craig initiated the wire transfer taking the bait and moving those specific funds directly into his corporate holding accounts, he did exactly what I needed him to do. He inadvertently provided the ultimate missing link. The digital footprint embedded in those federal funds allowed my forensic software to map the exact trajectory of his illegal money movement in real time. The tracking data instantly illuminated the previously hidden pathways, connecting his legitimate domestic front company directly to his illegal offshore wire network in Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands. Furthermore, by using stolen personal funds to float his corporate debts, he had officially commingled his assets, completely piercing the corporate veil and making himself personally liable for the entire federal collapse. He had literally handed the federal government the cryptographic keys to his own jail cell. Every frantic move Craig was making, now the defamatory social media videos, the vicious family text messages, the aggressive corporate cease and desist letter, the insidious whispers to my public clients, they were all utterly meaningless. He was fighting a loud, desperate war of public perception while I was quietly finalizing a silent war of federal prosecution. He thought he was playing a masterful game of chess, but the board had already been flipped, and the doors to the room were locked. The absolute hard proof of his massive corporate fraud and his personal embezzlement was now safely secured, compiled, and encrypted within the hands of federal regulators. I had the entire unassailable truth wrapped up in a perfect, undeniable digital package. The trap had snapped completely shut. The time for silent observation and covert data gathering was officially over. It was time to pull the curtain down on the grand illusion that had held my family hostage for years. It was time to let my parents look directly into the monster they had chosen to nurture over their own flesh and blood. I closed the evidence files on my secure monitor and locked my workstation. I picked up my personal cell phone, the one I had muted and ignored since the early morning digital assault began. I bypassed the dozens of hateful, unread messages from distant cousins and furious aunts, completely ignoring the toxic noise of the coordinated smear campaign. I opened the direct text message thread, containing only my mother and my father. I kept my message incredibly brief, stripped of any emotion, any defense, or any anger. I did not demand apologies. I did not mention Craig's ridiculous legal threats or Melanie's hysterical tear-filled video. Armed with absolute undeniable proof, I simply dictated the terms of our final engagement. I typed out a single short demand, asking them to meet me at a neutral, busy coffee shop downtown at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon. I ended the message by stating we needed to have an immediate and final family update. I hit send, dropped the phone into my leather briefcase, and stood up to walk out of my office, ready to watch their perfect world burn to ashes. The green indicator light on my desk console flashed in a rapid, steady rhythm, signaling the end of Craig's fifth, frantic voicemail. He had spent the entire morning flooding my phone with increasingly desperate messages, his polished executive persona completely disintegrating with each subsequent call. His voice had shifted from arrogant demands to pathetic whining, begging me to drop what he foolishly assumed was a civil lawsuit. He pleaded with me to contact my attorneys and release the hold on his corporate accounts, citing that family always looks out for family. I sat back in my leather chair and methodically deleted every single recording without a second thought. His panic was intoxicating, but it was merely a symptom of the real catastrophe unfolding within his shadow empire. Just as I reached out to power down my device to focus entirely on my ongoing forensic audit, the screen illuminated again. This time the caller identification did not display Craig's private number. It was Melanie. I paused, letting the phone ring for a few long seconds before I finally accepted the call and pressed the device to my ear. I braced myself for her usual weaponized condescension, fully expecting another calculated lecture about my supposed mental decline and my inability to be happy for her success. Instead, I was instantly met with the chaotic sound of hysterical, breathless sobbing. Melanie did not bother with a greeting or any form of polite introduction. She launched immediately into a vicious, ear-piercing tirade, her voice cracking violently under the immense weight of genuine blinding panic. She screamed into the receiver, calling me a monster, a deeply jealous, spiteful pariah who was actively dedicating her miserable life to destroying the only good thing our family had ever built. Through her manic, jagged tears, she finally revealed the source of her sudden, absolute terror. My parents had just received an aggressive certified delinquency notice directly from their primary banking institution. Craig had missed the massive monthly payment on the secret second mortgage he had fraudulently taken out against their pristine retirement estate. The lenders were not playing games. They were officially threatening immediate foreclosure procedures and demanding immediate restitution. Melanie shrieked that my frivolous, vindictive lawsuit was the sole reason Craig's corporate accounts were temporarily frozen. She completely bought into whatever intricate, comforting lie her husband had spun for her that morning. She was fiercely convinced that my imaginary civil litigation had single-handedly tied up his vast fortune, preventing him from making the bridge loan payments he had promised our parents. She demanded that I call my cheap lawyers, drop the fake extortion case, and release her husband money immediately so they could fix this minor banking error. She yelled that I was tearing my parents' health apart and that she would never ever forgive me for putting them through this stress. I sat perfectly still, listening to her hyperventilate, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, chilling clarity. I did not interrupt her. I let her exhaust her manic energy until her screams dissolved into a series of wet, ragged gasps. When the line finally fell relatively quiet, I spoke. My voice was perfectly flat, entirely devoid of any sisterly sympathy, any defensive anger, or any emotional inflection whatsoever. I told Melanie that she was vastly overestimating my personal legal power. I explained, speaking slowly and deliberately, as if addressing a particularly stubborn and deeply confused child, that a private citizen filing a standard civil defamation suit cannot instantly freeze international corporate assets. I told her that civil courts take months just to schedule a preliminary hearing, let alone authorize the total seizure of multi-million-dollar logistics accounts. I let the absolute silence hang heavy over the cellular connection for a long, devastating second before delivering the cold, undeniable truth. I informed my older sister that the only entity on Earth with the operational power to instantaneously lock down offshore accounts, halt international wire transfers across multiple jurisdictions, and completely freeze a multinational logistics company overnight is the federal government. I told her that Craig was not dealing with a jealous sister or a bitter local accountant. He was dealing directly with the severe, uncompromising authority of the United States Department of Justice and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The truth was simply too massive, too utterly devastating for Melanie to process. Her entire existence, her core identity, was entirely wrapped up in being the wealthy, untouchable wife of a visionary tech executive. Acknowledging the factual reality of my words meant acknowledging that her perfect husband was a ruthless criminal, and her entire glittering life was an elaborate parasitic fraud. Faced with the total destruction of her reality, she chose the familiar, comforting embrace of delusion. She completely rejected the facts. Melanie let out a harsh, jagged laugh, a sound that bordered on genuine clinical madness. She called me a pathological liar, insisting that my deep-seated jealousy had finally driven me completely insane. She screamed that Craig was a brilliant, respected executive who was currently orchestrating a multi-million-dollar global corporate expansion. She insisted that the federal government would never target a legitimate massive enterprise like his logistics firm. She vowed with absolute venom in her voice that she and my parents would never speak to me again, that I was completely dead to them, and that Craig would eventually crush me into the dirt in a court of law. Then she slammed the phone down, abruptly severing the connection and retreating back into her fragile, crumbling bubble. I placed my phone face down on the polished mahogany desk, knowing exactly what would transpire next. Craig was hopelessly cornered, bleeding unrecoverable cash by the hour, and completely losing control of his carefully curated public narrative. A rational, intelligent man would hire a defense attorney, pack his bags, and prepare for the inevitable federal indictment. But a malignant narcissist drowning in his own profound hubris always doubles down on the illusion. Craig needed to project an image of absolute, unwavering financial invincibility. He desperately needed to prove to his restless, angry investors, his terrified wife, and his deeply suspicious in-laws that he was completely untouched by any imaginary crisis. Within 48 hours, the rumors began quietly circulating through the downtown business network, confirming my exact predictions. Craig was liquidating whatever minor personal assets he could still legally access, draining secondary credit lines to fund a spectacular, obscenely extravagant event. He booked the grand ballroom at the city's most exclusive luxury hotel, publicly announcing a massive milestone company expansion gala. It was a desperate, manic smokescreen, a glittering facade designed to blind everyone with free-flowing imported champagne, expensive gourmet catering, and loud, confident declarations of future exponential profits. He was literally throwing $1 million party on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, attempting to deafen the sound of the rushing water with a string quartet. I monitored the gala preparations from the quiet, highly secure confines of my office, tracking the desperate, erratic expenditures through his rapidly evaporating credit lines. He was burning through cash he did not possess to impress people who would abandon him the second the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. A week later, my front receptionist walked into my office, holding a thick, premium black envelope adorned with heavy, silver embossed lettering. I took the envelope and sliced it open with my letter opener, pulling out a heavy cardstock VIP invitation to Craig Grand Expansion Gala. It was directly addressed to me, a blatant, pathetic display of his unyielding arrogance. He wanted to show me that he was still the king of the world, regardless of my petty accusations. But the real prize was tucked neatly inside the thick, silver-lined envelope. A small, expensive piece of custom stationery fluttered out and landed squarely on my desk. It was a handwritten note from Melanie. The dark ink was pressed so deeply into the heavy paper that I could trace the furious, vindictive energy in every single loop and line. She dared me to attend the event. She wrote that it was finally time for me to step out of my miserable little apartment and see what real, undeniable success actually looked like. She stated that I needed to witness firsthand the empire her husband had built so I could finally understand how pathetic my jealous lies truly were. She wanted to humiliate me publicly, surrounding herself with high society friends and wealthy investors to prove once and for all that she was the ultimate winner and I was the pathetic, broken loser. I read Melanie's spiteful, delusional words leaning back in my chair and feeling a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. They truly believed they had won. They genuinely thought this glittering, expensive charade would finally put me in my designated place and silence my accurate accusations permanently. They wanted me to witness their monumental success. They wanted me to be fully present for their grand, triumphant moment in the dazzling spotlight. I reached out, pulled my keyboard closer, and navigated directly to the custom luxury website listed at the bottom of the silver invitation. I typed in my unique alphanumeric VIP access code, bypassing the standard guest registry. I moved the cursor across the bright glowing screen, clicked directly on the formal response button, and RSVP'd yes. The air inside the Imperial Grand Hotel ballroom was thick with the overwhelming scent of imported orchids and desperate financial posturing. Craig had spared absolutely no expense in constructing this magnificent towering monument to his own ego. Towering ice sculptures carved into the shape of cargo ships dominated the buffet tables, while waiters in crisp white coats circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. It was a sickening display of stolen wealth designed to blind the exact people who were currently funding it. I arrived exactly 20 minutes after the doors opened, bypassing the red carpet photo line and stepping directly into the cavernous, glittering space. I had chosen my attire with meticulous calculation. I did not wear the muted conservative business suits my family was so accustomed to seeing me in. I wore a floor-length tailored emerald green silk gown that fit perfectly, projecting an image of absolute, unbothered power. I did not look like the defeated, disgraced outcast they expected to slink through the back doors. I looked like a woman who owned the room. The moment I stepped onto the plush carpet, the whispers began. My extended family occupied two massive reserved tables near the front of the stage. My Aunt Patricia caught sight of me first, her jaw dropping slightly before she leaned over to furiously whisper into my uncle ear. One by one, their heads turned in my direction. Their faces were an identical mixture of outrage and morbid curiosity. They had all been fed the narrative. They all believed I was a hysterical, jealous spinster who had tried to extort her brilliant brother-in-law and had been swiftly crushed by his superior legal team. I met their collective judgmental stares with absolute ice-cold neutrality. I did not offer a wave or a polite nod. I simply glided past their tables, navigating the crowded room with predatory grace. Melanie had arranged the seating chart with deliberate, malicious intent. She had placed my assigned seat at a small, isolated table situated right at the edge of the primary spotlight, ensuring I was highly visible to the entire room but completely segregated from the family unit. She wanted me on display. She wanted the Portland corporate elite and the nervous offshore investors to see the physical manifestation of the toxic obstacle Craig had so bravely overcome. I pulled out my chair and sat down, placing my sleek black leather clutch squarely on the pristine white tablecloth. I spent the next hour silently observing the magnificent, terrifying house of cards. The room was packed with over 300 guests, but the underlying energy was entirely wrong. A truly successful corporate expansion gala vibrates with genuine excitement and relaxed confidence. This room hummed with a frantic, tightly coiled anxiety. I watched the venture capitalists and the private equity managers huddled in tight circles near the bar. Their smiles strained their eyes, constantly darting around the room. They were men who had poured millions into Craig offshore accounts, and they were desperately searching for reassurance that their money was safe. Craig had thrown this million-dollar party to pacify them, to project a visual illusion of liquidity that his frozen bank accounts could no longer support. The heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed, signaling the beginning of the main event. A booming professional voice echoed over the state-of-the-art sound system, introducing the visionary founder and chief executive officer of the future of global logistics. The crowd erupted into applause, but it felt forced, obligatory. Craig strode out from behind the velvet curtains and took his place behind the lucite podium. He wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. From a distance, he looked like the ultimate master of the universe. But from my vantage point near the front of the stage, I could see the severe microscopic cracks in his immaculate facade. Under the harsh glare of the spotlight, a thin, unmistakable sheen of nervous sweat coated his upper lip and forehead. His hands gripped the edges of the podium so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. He was a man actively bleeding out, pretending he did not notice the massive pool of red forming at his feet. He leaned into the microphone and delivered a sweeping, practiced monologue. He spoke of exponential quarterly growth, global supply chain dominance, and the aggressive acquisition of new international territories. He threw out massive fabricated revenue projections and promised his investors that the minor temporary banking delays they might have recently experienced were simply the growing pains of a company expanding too rapidly for traditional financial institutions to handle. It was a masterful hypnotic performance designed to soothe the terrified egos of the men who funded his life. Then he pivoted. His voice dropped an octave, taking on a deeply serious, intimate tone. He shifted the focus of his speech from corporate strategy to the concept of absolute unwavering family loyalty. He gestured grandly toward the front tables, where William and Linda sat beaming with profound unearned pride. He praised his in-laws, calling them the steadfast bedrock of his success, the visionary supporters who had believed in his mission when no one else would. He publicly thanked them for their recent massive capital injection, failing to mention that he had acquired it by illegally leveraging their fully paid-off home behind their backs. William puffed out his chest, clapping loudly, while Linda dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, soaking up the public validation they so desperately craved. But Craig was not finished. He tightened his grip on the microphone, his charismatic smile twisting into a sharp, predatory sneer. He told the silent, packed ballroom that true greatness always attracts desperate, bitter detractors. He spoke of navigating through vicious corporate sabotage and overcoming toxic, jealous obstacles that attempt to tear down what others have worked so hard to build. As he delivered the line, he slowly turned his head and locked his eyes directly on me. The spotlight seemed to shift, catching the emerald silk of my gown. The entire ballroom followed his gaze. 300 corporate executives, wealthy investors, and hostile family members turned to stare at the isolated woman sitting alone at the edge of the stage. It was a calculated theatrical execution. He was attempting to publicly brand me as the villain, to definitively destroy my credibility in front of the entire Portland business community before I could expose his fraud. He wanted to break me so completely that no one would ever believe a single word I said. I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze or shrink under the crushing weight of their collective judgment. I sat perfectly upright, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and held his stare with a look of terrifying absolute boredom. I watched the muscle in his jaw twitch. My complete lack of humiliation infuriated him. The speech concluded to a roar of thunderous applause. The house lights flared back up, signaling the transition to the formal dinner service. Craig descended the stage steps and was immediately flanked by his royal court. Melanie rushed forward, draped in a silver sequined gown and a diamond necklace that had been entirely funded by stolen venture capital. She linked her arm tightly through his, leaning into him with aggressive, possessive pride. William and Linda fell into step right behind them, acting as his proud suburban bodyguards. They did not mingle with the corporate guests. They did not stop to shake hands with the nervous investors. Craig led his family in a direct, straight line across the ballroom floor, marching purposefully toward my isolated table. The surrounding guests, sensing the sudden sharp shift in the atmosphere, fell completely silent. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of networking abruptly ceased. Everyone in the immediate vicinity stopped to watch the golden executive finally confront the toxic, jealous obstacle he had just denounced on stage. Craig stopped exactly 2 feet from my table, looking down at me with a sickening mixture of manufactured pity and genuine venom. Melanie stood beside him, her chin raised in a portrait of pure, unadulterated arrogance. William crossed his arms over his chest, glaring at me with stern paternal disappointment, while Linda looked at me as if I were a piece of trash that had somehow blown into this magnificent luxury ballroom. Craig leaned forward, placing both of his hands flat on my table, encroaching on my physical space in a classic corporate intimidation tactic. He lowered his voice, projecting his words just loud enough for the surrounding tables of elite investors to hear every single syllable clearly. "Still waiting on that $150,000, Joanna?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed in the silent space. "I told you before, you are completely out of your depth. You thought you could extort my company with a frivolous fake lawsuit, and now look at you. You are nothing. You have absolutely nothing." He stood back up, brushing imaginary dust off his expensive tuxedo jacket. "If you are hungry, Joanna, you can have a seat at the back with the catering staff. That is where you belong." Melanie let out a sharp, cruel laugh, leaning her head against Craig's shoulder. William nodded, his thick neck flushed with righteous anger, while Linda simply turned her face away entirely, refusing to even look at the disgraced daughter who had dared to challenge her perfect son-in-law. They stood there waiting for the inevitable collapse. They waited for the tears to fall. They waited for me to grab my coat and run from the ballroom in absolute devastating shame, entirely destroyed by their unified public rejection. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor or explain the reality of the frozen offshore accounts to the listening crowd. I simply looked at Craig, noting the frantic, rapid pulse beating visibly in his neck despite his arrogant words. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and heavy. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up, rising to my full height. The smooth silk of my emerald gown cascaded to the floor. I looked directly into Craig, terrified, desperate eyes completely ignoring my parents and my sister. I reached down to the pristine white tablecloth and slowly unclasped the heavy brass lock of my black leather clutch. I did not pull out a tissue. I did not pull out my car keys to flee the scene. I reached inside and retrieved a single thick manila folder heavily stamped with vivid red federal seals. I pulled the thick manila folder from my black leather clutch and held it out, suspended in the dead, tense air between us. The vivid red federal stamps pressed across the heavy cover seemed to practically glow under the harsh, blinding light of the expensive crystal chandeliers overhead. Craig stared down at the document, his arrogant, sneering smile faltering for a microscopic fraction of a second. He clearly did not want to touch it. His primal survival instincts were undoubtedly screaming at him to turn around, walk away, and instruct his private security team to drag me out the back doors. But we were entirely surrounded. 300 of his most vital offshore investors, top-tier venture capitalists, and wealthy local socialites were watching his every single move. The entire grand ballroom had fallen into a deep, suffocating silence, waiting to see how the brilliant, untouchable tech executive would handle this highly public confrontation. He had no choice but to play the part of the unbothered corporate titan. He snatched the folder from my outstretched hand with a sharp, aggressive motion, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh meant to convey supreme executive boredom to the listening crowd. He flipped the heavy cardboard cover open, his dark eyes dropping instantly to the very first page. I stood perfectly still and watched the exact moment his brain processed the impossibly dense, highly classified financial tracking logs printed on the crisp white paper. He was looking directly at the unredacted digital footprint of his own massive, catastrophic mistake. He saw the exact alphanumeric identifiers of the $150,000 wire transfer he had stolen from my account, mapped out meticulously through 3 different international routing protocols, and traced straight into his currently frozen Cayman Islands shell company. He saw his own forged authorizing signatures alongside the undeniable proof that he had completely commingled stolen federal bait funds with his fraudulent corporate assets. A thick, heavy bead of cold sweat broke out along his hairline, tracing a slow, agonizing path down his temple. The color violently drained from his handsome face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His eyes darted frantically back and forth across the pages, reading the devastating federal tracking numbers over and over again, as if hoping the ink would miraculously rearrange itself into a different reality. The surrounding crowd of elite investors noticed the sudden drastic shift in his demeanor. The nervous whispers at the adjacent tables grew slightly louder, a rising tide of genuine corporate anxiety. I kept my voice perfectly modulated, ensuring its icy calm register carried effortlessly to the surrounding tables of terrified executives. I checked my account, Craig. I said, meeting his panicked, terrified gaze with absolute clinical precision. You drained it. He swallowed hard, his throat working visibly against the collar of his bespoke tuxedo shirt, but he could not find his voice. I did not break eye contact. But you were right, I continued smoothly, my tone entirely devoid of any sisterly warmth or familial hesitation. You needed it more than me. Because stealing from a federally monitored tracking account just upgraded your state theft charge to a federal wire fraud felony. The word felony dropped like a heavy physical weight into the dead silence of the ballroom. A sharp collective gasp echoed from the private equity managers seated directly behind my chair. Linda let out a strangled, horrified noise, bringing her lace handkerchief up to cover her mouth as she stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. William bristled his face, turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he stepped forward, ready to unleash decades of conditioned paternal rage to silence me. But they were all entirely irrelevant now. The game was solely between Craig and the catastrophic reality he had created. Craig knew the game was over. He knew the red-stamped documents in his shaking hands represented the absolute, undeniable end of his freedom. But a malignant narcissist drowning in his own profound hubris will always fight to the bitter end to preserve his beloved illusion. He could not surrender in front of the wealthy audience he had spent millions to impress. He desperately needed to project an image of absolute, unwavering financial invincibility, even as the ground completely collapsed beneath his polished leather shoes. He slammed the thick folder shut, the loud, sharp smack of paper against paper, startling the wealthy guests at the closest tables. He tossed the federal documents onto the pristine white tablecloth as if the contents had physically burned his fingers. He pushed his broad shoulders back, puffed out his chest, and desperately tried to reinflate his punctured authority. "We needed it more than you," he spat, his voice incredibly harsh and overly loud, attempting to project absolute dominance to the whispering crowd. "You are bluffing. You have no power here." He looked quickly toward William and Linda, silently demanding their blind, unyielding support. They offered it instantly, completely rejecting the reality of the federal documents lying right in front of them. William sneered at me, declaring loudly that I was a deeply disturbed, highly jealous individual who was actively trying to ruin my sister's perfect life out of pure spite. Linda nodded vigorously, her face twisted into a mask of maternal disgust, telling the surrounding guests that I had always been the broken, defective child of the family. They were entirely willing to sink to the absolute bottom of the ocean, rather than admit they had bet their entire retirement and their parental affection on a ruthless con artist. I felt a sudden sharp rush of pure adrenaline flood my veins. It was the intense physical tremor, a slight shaking in my hands, that had absolutely nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the intoxicating thrill of final, undeniable victory. I did not yell back at my father. I did not bother trying to convince my mother of the truth. I simply looked at the pathetic, glittering house of cards they had built together and felt the decades of emotional abuse finally wash away completely. I was no longer the quiet, manageable daughter they could bully into submission. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. Trembling slightly with pure adrenaline, I reached forward and slowly picked up my black leather clutch. I pulled the gold zipper shut, the sharp metallic click, sounding impossibly loud in the tense, suffocating quiet of the luxury ballroom. I looked at Craig, noting the frantic, rapid pulse beating wildly in his neck, despite his arrogant posturing. "Then you will not mind what is coming next," I said, my voice perfectly steady. Melanie stepped forward, completely unable to comprehend the gravity of the situation. Her entire existence was entirely wrapped up in being the wealthy, untouchable wife of a visionary tech executive. She threw her head back and let out a loud, piercing, mocking laugh. It was a harsh, grating sound, entirely devoid of genuine humor, intended solely to publicly shame me. She leaned heavily into her husband, wrapping her arm tightly around his waist and looking at me with pure, unadulterated venom. She told me I was pathetic, an absolute disgrace to the family name, and a highly disturbed woman who needed immediate psychiatric help. Craig joined in her performance, his own laughter booming and forceful. It was a desperate, highly theatrical display meant to reassure the terrified investors watching from the shadows. He wanted the room to believe that my federal folder was nothing more than the unhinged prop of a jealous, hysterical sister-in-law. He wrapped his arm around Melanie, pulling her close and kissing the side of her head, playing the role of the protective, successful patriarch, defending his beautiful wife from a toxic relative. They shared their loud, mocking laugh, letting the sound wash over the silent ballroom, clinging desperately to their magnificent illusion, refusing to accept that the ice had already completely shattered beneath their feet. The mockery reached a fever pitch, filling the massive, cavernous space. William took a threatening step toward me, loudly declaring that he was calling hotel security to have me dragged out into the street. Linda turned to the nearest table of venture capitalists, offering a loud, syrupy apology for her severely disturbed daughter's unprovoked outburst. They were a unified, invincible front of perfect suburban wealth, absolutely convinced of their total superiority. And then it happened. A deafening, incredibly heavy bang shook the very walls of the luxury hotel ballroom. It was a violent, explosive sound that instantly severed the performative laughter from Craig and Melanie throats. The massive, heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom flew completely open, hitting the adjacent walls with a violent, echoing crash. The entire room of 300 corporate elites fell completely, utterly, and instantly silent. Through the shattered entrance poured a precise, highly coordinated wave of federal agents and local armed police. The stark yellow lettering of FBI across their dark tactical windbreakers stood in jarring, violent contrast to the sea of imported silk and bespoke velvet occupying the grand ballroom. The string quartet positioned on the elevated mahogany stage abruptly ceased playing, ending on a harsh, discordant screech of a cello bow that echoed through the cavernous space. The sheer, polished elegance of the million-dollar corporate expansion gala was instantly absolutely decimated by the blunt, overwhelming force of federal law enforcement. Craig's arrogant sneer vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated primal terror. The heavy red-stamped manila folder I had dropped on the table was suddenly the least of his concerns. Two lead agents bypassed the terrified, scattering investors and marched in a direct, unyielding line straight toward our table. Craig took one frantic, involuntary step backward, his perfectly polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the marble floor. He raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender, but it was entirely useless. The agents moved with practiced clinical efficiency. One grabbed Craig by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him chest first against the very table where he had just stood mocking me. The crystal champagne flutes shattered onto the floor as his face was pressed hard into the pristine white linen. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around Craig's wrists resonated through the dead quiet room. The lead agent leaned in close, his voice booming with absolute authority, as he read Craig, his Miranda rights, detailing charges of federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and massive corporate embezzlement. The surrounding crowd of venture capitalists and private equity managers, the very men Craig had spent millions attempting to impress, physically recoiled. They stared in absolute horror as their visionary tech genius was reduced to a sweating, trembling criminal right before their eyes. The illusion was completely shattered. Melanie broke the silence with a raw, hysterical shriek. She lunged forward, her diamond necklace catching the harsh light as she desperately tried to grab the federal agent pushing her husband. A secondary officer immediately intercepted her, stepping firmly in her path and raising a commanding hand. Melanie began to hyperventilate, her perfectly curated high society persona dissolving into absolute frantic madness. She screamed that there was a massive mistake, that her husband was a brilliant executive, and that they were arresting the wrong person. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me, shrieking that I was the one responsible for this insane misunderstanding. The agents ignored her entirely, treating her like an irritating, buzzing insect, while they thoroughly searched Craig's pockets and secured his encrypted cell phone. William and Linda stood completely paralyzed, rooted to the expensive carpet like statues of salt. William's ruddy face had drained to a sickly ashen gray, his mouth hanging open in silent, uncomprehending horror. He watched the federal agents haul his golden son-in-law away, and his entire worldview completely collapsed. The brilliant, untouchable patriarch of the family, the man who had confidently lectured me on loyalty and corporate success just hours prior, was utterly destroyed. Linda clutched her husband's arm, her knuckles white, her eyes wide and unblinking. She looked at the handcuffs, she looked at the shattered crystal, and then she looked at me. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of vindictive satisfaction. I simply reached across the table, picked up my untouched flute of vintage champagne, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I maintained absolute eye contact with my mother, watching as the devastating, undeniable reality finally pierced through decades of her toxic, delusional favoritism. I stood in my emerald green silk gown, a portrait of total unbothered calm, while the federal agents marched Craig out of the grand ballroom, his head bowed in absolute ultimate disgrace. In the grueling, chaotic days that immediately followed the gala, the absolute destruction of Craig's fraudulent empire was swift and merciless. The local news cycle became entirely consumed by the scandal. The headlines blasted the staggering details of the multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme, broadcasting Craig's disheveled mugshot across every major network and financial publication. He had been stripped of his expensive tailored suits and forced into a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, a jarring visual representation of his catastrophic fall from grace. During his initial arraignment hearing, the presiding federal judge took one look at the extensive documentation of his hidden Cayman Island shell companies and the massive web of international wire transfers I had provided to the task force. Citing him as an extreme flight risk with access to highly sophisticated offshore networks, the judge completely denied bail. Craig was remanded directly to federal custody, sent to a cold concrete cell, entirely cut off from the luxury and power he had built his entire identity around. Simultaneously, the federal government formally initiated the absolute seizure of every single asset tied to his criminal enterprise. The company credit lines completely evaporated overnight. The sleek downtown corporate headquarters was immediately shuttered, its glass doors locked and sealed with federal notices. The luxury vehicles, the expensive imported watches, the vast art collection, and the sprawling suburban mansion were all frozen and slated for federal auction to provide restitution to the furious defrauded investors. Melanie was left standing in the absolute wreckage of her fabricated life, completely, entirely alone. The federal investigators did not simply take her luxury cars and freeze her bank accounts. They arrived at her mansion with cardboard boxes and systematically stripped her of every designer handbag, every piece of expensive jewelry, and every high-end asset purchased with stolen investor capital. Furthermore, her nightmare was only just beginning. Because Craig had routinely used her as a convenient pawn, requiring her to blindly co-sign his fraudulent corporate tax returns and list her name as a secondary officer on his domestic holding companies, the federal prosecutors were actively investigating her for criminal complicity. She was no longer just the humiliated wife of a convicted con artist. She was drowning in millions of dollars of unrecoverable debt, facing potential federal indictment, and entirely dependent on a high-priced legal defense team she could no longer afford to pay. The collateral damage inflicted upon William and Linda was equally absolute and utterly devastating. The terrifying reality of the fraudulent commercial second mortgage finally crashed down upon them with the unforgiving force of a tidal wave. The aggressive banking institution holding the massive defaulted bridge loan did not care about family loyalty or Craig's charming promises. They only cared about recovering their capital. Within a week, the bank formally initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings against my parents' pristine, sprawling, suburban estate. William desperately tried to leverage his country club connections, calling his wealthy friends and former business partners begging for a massive personal loan to save his home. But the taint of the massive federal scandal had completely poisoned his name. His calls went entirely unreturned. His lifelong friends suddenly abandoned him, treating him like a complete pariah. Linda suffered a total psychological collapse. The manicured lawns, the country club gossip, and the suffocating suburban fortress she had lorded over for 4 decades were instantly ripped away. They were forced to confront the terrifying, undeniable fact that they had completely lost their home, their entire life savings, and their precious social standing, because they had blindly signed their lives away to a charismatic monster while actively seeking to destroy the only daughter who had tried to save them. They were entirely destitute, facing their golden years with absolutely nothing but the crushing, unbearable weight of their own monumental mistakes. Exactly 1 week after the federal raid shattered the grand ballroom, I sat quietly in my secure corner office overlooking the busy downtown financial district. The morning sun streamed through the large glass windows, casting a warm glow across my polished mahogany desk. The heavy, chaotic noise of my family's absolute destruction felt entirely distant, a storm raging in a completely different universe. I was calmly reviewing a new, highly classified digital forensic file for the task force, tracing another complex web of offshore accounts entirely detached from the burning wreckage of Craig Logistics' empire. The satisfying rhythmic click of my keyboard was the only sound in the peaceful, quiet room. I took a slow sip of my hot black coffee, savoring the profound, absolute silence of a life finally completely under my own control, my own. The glowing green indicator light on my desk console suddenly flashed, interrupting my focus. A soft chime echoed through the room, followed immediately by the crisp, professional voice of my front desk receptionist filtering through the intercom speaker. She sounded unusually tense, a slight tremor of apprehension breaking through her normal polished demeanor. She informed me that my family was currently standing in the main lobby of the secure building. She stated that my father, my mother, and my sister were demanding to be led up to my office immediately, claiming it was an absolute life-or-death emergency, and refusing to leave the premises until they spoke with me. I stopped typing, letting my hands rest lightly on the edge of the desk. I looked at the flashing green light on the console, feeling a slow, cold, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face as I reached out to press the response button. I pressed my index finger firmly against the glowing green button on the console and calmly instructed my receptionist to escort them back to my office. The heavy frosted glass door to my suite clicked open a moment later. The three figures that shuffled into my pristine, quiet workspace bore absolutely zero resemblance to the arrogant, untouchable royalty that had attempted to publicly execute me just 1 week prior. The sheer magnitude of their financial and social annihilation was physically etched into their posture. They looked as though they had been struck by a massive catastrophic force. Melanie entered first. Her signature weaponized condescension had completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a woman. She wore a plain, oversized gray sweater and dark sunglasses that utterly failed to hide her violently red, swollen eyes. Her perfectly styled blonde hair hung limp and unwashed around her pale face. Behind her, William and Linda stumbled in, looking as though they had aged 20 years in 7 days. The impeccably tailored suits and expensive diamond accents were gone, replaced by wrinkled off-the-rack clothing that hung loosely on their defeated frames. They stood awkwardly on the plush rug of my office, staring at the polished mahogany desk and the panoramic view of the city skyline as if they had just landed on an alien planet. Melanie did not wait for an invitation to speak. She rushed forward, placing her bare, trembling hands flat on the surface of my desk. The massive diamond engagement ring that had once been her prized possession was conspicuously absent, undoubtedly seized by federal agents or pawned for quick, desperate cash. She began to weep, her voice cracking violently as she pleaded with me. She begged for a massive personal loan. She stammered that Craig was facing decades in federal prison and the government had frozen absolutely everything, including her personal checking accounts. She needed millions of dollars to retain a top-tier criminal defense attorney, not just for him, but to fight her own looming federal complicity charges. She sobbed that I was the only person left on Earth who had the liquidity and the connections to save her from going to federal prison. She actually dared to use the word family, sobbing heavily that sisters always protect each other when things get desperate. I listened to her hysterical, frantic pleading without moving a single muscle. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer a word of comfort. I simply watched her hyperventilate, noting the absolute staggering hypocrisy of the woman who had publicly commanded me to sit with the catering staff, now begging on her knees for my financial salvation. When Melanie, breathless, sobbing, yielded no reaction from me whatsoever, William and Linda desperately pushed their way forward. My father's jaw trembled uncontrollably. The commanding, booming patriarch, who had confidently signed away his entire legacy to a charismatic criminal, was completely gone. He reached out with shaking hands, attempting a pathetic, placating gesture. He told me that they had been foolishly blinded, that they had made a terrible, catastrophic mistake in trusting Craig. My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with a sickening manufactured sweetness that made my stomach turn. She wept loudly, wiping her eyes, and claiming with absolute staggering audacity that they had always known Craig was bad news. She insisted they had always harbored deep suspicions about his offshore corporate operations, but were simply trying to support their eldest daughter. Then the true motivation for their visit was laid completely bare. Linda leaned over my desk, her voice dropping to a desperate, pathetic whisper. She stated that the bank had officially locked them out of their estate that morning. They had nowhere to go. Their credit was completely destroyed, their accounts were entirely empty, and their country club friends had universally blacklisted them. She pleaded with me to let them move into the spare bedroom of my apartment, crying that I was their own flesh and blood, their absolute only hope in this terrifying nightmare. They genuinely expected me to open my doors and absorb the catastrophic consequences of their own monumental greed. I let their pathetic wails and desperate apologies hang in the quiet air of my office for a long, devastating minute. I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers, and looking at the three shattered people standing before me. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep burning anger, the desperate childhood longing for their approval, the quiet agonizing pain of constant rejection, it was all entirely gone. They had finally managed to completely extinguish every last microscopic drop of empathy I possessed. I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy white paper. I placed it face up on the polished mahogany and slid it smoothly across the surface, stopping exactly in front of my father's trembling hands. He looked down at the document, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer, uncomprehending shock. It was a formal, itemized invoice from my financial consulting firm detailing the exact hours I had spent unwinding their fraudulent second mortgage. "This is my standard consultation fee for discovering you are bankrupt," I said, my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of emotion. William's mouth opened and closed silently, unable to process the cold, undeniable rejection printed on the paper. Melanie gasped, stepping back as if I had physically struck her. Linda let out a sharp, offended cry, demanding to know how I could be so incredibly cruel to my own parents in their darkest hour. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with their outrage. I kept my gaze locked directly on my mother. "You made your choices," I stated calmly. "You chose the glittering illusion. You chose the golden son-in-law. You chose to publicly mock and discard me to protect a federal criminal. You bet your entire existence on a fraud, and you lost absolutely everything. As for housing, I suggest you try the local shelters. I hear they build character." The absolute finality of my words struck them with the force of a physical blow. The realization that I was not going to save them, that I was not going to fund their legal defense or provide a roof over their heads, finally pierced through their deeply ingrained entitlement. Melanie dropped to her knees right there on the office carpet, wailing hysterically and grabbing at the edge of my desk. Linda began to shriek, accusing me of being a monster, a heartless, unnatural daughter who was actively condemning her own parents to the streets. William simply stared at the invoice, weeping silently, his shoulders shaking with the crushing, unbearable weight of total defeat. I completely ignored their chaotic, desperate performance. I reached out and pressed the button on my intercom system. I instructed my receptionist to immediately send up building security to escort 3 unauthorized trespassers off the premises. Within 60 seconds, 2 large uniformed guards entered my suite. They firmly grabbed William and Melanie by their arms, hauling them toward the frosted glass doors, while Linda stumbled blindly behind them, still screaming my name. I did not look back. I turned my chair toward the massive windows, looking out over the city as the heavy glass doors clicked firmly shut, cutting off the sound of their wailing permanently. I had established an ironclad permanent boundary. I was walking away from my toxic biological family for good. 6 months later, the air inside my newly renovated home was filled with the rich, warm scent of roasted garlic and the bright, echoing sound of genuine laughter. The sprawling, open-concept dining room was a vibrant testament to the life I had built entirely on my own terms. The massive oak table was surrounded by my chosen family. My loyal colleagues, the brilliant forensic accountants who had stood by me during the grueling federal investigation, and the steadfast friends who had celebrated my victories without an ounce of jealousy, filled the room with joyous energy. There were no strained smiles, no performative wealth, no hidden agendas lurking beneath the conversation. We were celebrating the official launch of my own independent financial auditing firm, a venture that had already secured massive corporate contracts across the city. The news of Craig's conviction and his 20-year federal prison sentence was old forgotten history, a minor footnote in the past. My parents and sister had vanished into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the consequences they had earned, entirely erased from my existence. I stood at the head of the table, holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine. The room quieted down, turning their warm, supportive faces toward me. I raised my glass, looking at the beautiful, authentic life I had created from the ashes of their rejection. I was finally successful, untouchable, and completely undeniably free. The spectacular downfall of Craig and the shattering of his carefully curated illusion teach us a profound truth about toxic environments. Loyalty demanded at the expense of your dignity is not love. It is exploitation. For years, Joanna's family valued the glittering facade of wealth and the false charm of a con artist over the genuine substance of their own daughter. They confused enabling with support, and in their desperate scramble for status, they sacrificed their moral compass and their financial security. Joanna's journey reminds us that true power does not lie in screaming the loudest or throwing the most expensive party. True power is found in quiet preparation, undeniable facts, and the courage to refuse participation in someone else's delusion. When the people who are supposed to protect you actively choose to throw you to the wolves, you owe them nothing. Not your resources, not your emotional labor, and certainly not your future. Forgiveness is often touted as a family obligation, but walking away is sometimes the only survival strategy. You're allowed to hand someone the bill for their own malicious choices. You're allowed to close the door on those who only value you when they need to be saved from their own hubris. Blood might make you relatives, but respect, mutual support, and shared integrity are what make a family. Joanna did not lose her family. She simply shed the dead weight and chose her own. Have you ever had to establish an ironclad boundary with toxic relatives who only wanted you around when it benefited them? How did you find the strength to walk away and build your own chosen family? Share your experiences in the comments below. If Joanna's story of reclaiming her power resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and ultimate justice.